Before we go any further into Emmy Cole's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, if you believe that a stranger's kindness can be the difference between a life lost and a life saved, hit that subscribe button right now. Tell me what city you're watching from today. Because this story starts in a place where hope had all but dried up, and it needed one man's hands to water it again. Caleb Dawson pressed his palm flat against the girl's back and felt her ribs shudder under his hand. Shallow, desperate breaths, the kind a person makes when breathing itself has become an act of courage. She was maybe 10 years old. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Her dress had been torn at the shoulder and tied back together with what looked like a strip of feed sack. And when he turned her face toward the light from the kitchen window, he saw the bruise that ran from her left cheekbone all the way down to her jaw, dark as a thundercloud shaped like a man's knuckles. "Lord Almighty," he whispered. She opened her eyes, brown, terrified, and somehow still fighting. She said 2 words before she lost consciousness entirely. "They hurt me." If you've ever watched someone come back from a place so dark they forgot the way out, then stay with me, because this story is for you. Caleb Dawson had not opened his front door with any expectation of finding the world changed on the other side of it. That was simply how he had lived for the past 7 years, opening doors out of habit, moving through mornings out of obligation, eating because the body demanded it, and sleeping because exhaustion eventually won out over grief. He was 57 years old, and he had the hands of a man 20 years older than that, cracked at the knuckles, stained permanent brown from walnut stain and linseed oil. The hands of a carpenter who had worked through every feeling he'd ever had rather than speak it aloud. He'd been on his way to the porch to check the sky. August in Wyoming had a way of building heat so thick you could lean against it, and he'd been watching the clouds to the west all afternoon, wondering if rain would come before nightfall and save him the trouble of hauling water to the kitchen garden his late wife Clara had planted the spring before she died. He still kept that garden going. He couldn't have told anyone why exactly. It wasn't sentimentality, or at least that's what he told himself. It was just that the tomatoes kept coming up, whether he wanted them to or not, and it seemed wrong to let a living thing die out of pure stubbornness. He pushed open the screen door. She was already falling. He caught her more by instinct than intention, his left arm sweeping out and taking her weight before his mind had fully registered what was happening. She was small, lighter than he expected, which frightened him more than her appearance did, because light meant hungry, and hungry meant this had been going on for some time. "Whoa now," he said. A ridiculous thing to say to an unconscious child, but it was what came out. He lowered himself to one knee on the porch boards and got her settled across his thighs, one hand cradling her head. She was breathing. He made himself confirm that first, before he looked at anything else, because the looking was going to take something from him, and he needed to be steady for it. She breathed. Then he looked. The bruise on her face was the worst of what was visible, but it wasn't the only thing. There was a welt that ran along her left forearm, raised and pink at the edges, the kind of mark left by something narrow and deliberate, a strap or a switch, or worse. Her feet were in terrible shape. Whatever walking she'd done to reach his porch, she'd done it without shoes, and the soles were cut and crusted over in ways that made his jaw tighten. Her hair had been braided at some point, and the braid had mostly come undone, and there were leaves caught in it. That told him she'd been sleeping outside, or running through brush, or both. "Child," he said quietly, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids moved, not open, but moved. "You're safe. You're on my porch. My name's Caleb. I'm not going to hurt you." He said it again, softer. "You're safe." He carried her inside. He had not carried anyone in 7 years. The weight of another human body in his arms was a sensation so specific and so remembered that it hit him somewhere behind the sternum, hard enough that he had to stop in the middle of his front room and breathe through it. He set her on the long settle near the window, the one Clara had covered in old grain sacking because the original fabric had worn through, and he went to the kitchen and pumped water into his cleanest basin and found the linen he kept folded in the sideboard drawer. When he came back, she was watching him. "You're awake," he said. "I'm sorry." Her voice was small and roughened, the voice of someone who had been crying for a long time, and then stopped because crying required energy she no longer had. "I didn't know where else to go." "Don't apologize." He pulled the low stool close and sat on it, setting the basin on the floor. "What's your name?" "Emmy," she swallowed. "Emmy Cole." "How old are you, Emmy Cole?" 10. She looked at the basin, then at his hands. "Are you going to clean them? My feet?" "If you'll let me." She nodded. And something in the way she nodded, careful, considered, like she was calculating the risk of trust, told him more than anything else she might have said. He worked slowly. He had cleaned enough wounds in his life to know that speed was the enemy. Not for medical reasons, though those applied too, but because a frightened creature, human or otherwise, needed time to learn that the hands touching them meant something different than the hands that had hurt them. He talked while he worked, not about anything important, the weather, the kitchen garden, the fact that he'd seen a red-tailed hawk building a nest in the cottonwood out back, which was unusual for this late in the season. She let him talk. After a while, she stopped watching his hands and started watching his face. He took that as a good sign. "Who brought you here?" he asked when he'd moved on to her arm. "Nobody. I walked." "From where?" She hesitated. "Emmy." He kept his voice even. "I'm not asking so I can send you back. I'm asking because I need to understand what happened to you." "The Cole Ranch," she said. "It's about 4 miles east." The Cole Ranch. He knew of it. Most people in Harlan County knew of the Cole Ranch, or, more accurately, they knew of Darius Cole, who owned the eastern portion of it and had opinions about the western portion that had been generating legal disputes for the better part of a decade. "Is Darius Cole your kin?" Her whole body changed. It was subtle, a slight drawing inward, a stiffening in the shoulders. But he felt it under his hands. "He's my uncle," she said. Caleb set down the cloth. He looked at her arm. He looked at the welt on her face. Then he looked at her eyes, which were holding his with a steadiness that must have cost her considerable effort. "Did your uncle do this to you?" The silence lasted long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "He has a whip, braided leather. He uses it on the horses when they don't mind." She paused. "And on other things." Caleb picked up the cloth again. His hands were completely steady. He was rather proud of that. "Where is your father?" he asked. "That's why I came here." She reached into the front of her dress, the movement careful, like it hurt to twist, and produced a folded envelope. The paper was soft and water-stained at the creases. "Papa gave this to Widow Hargrove before he left for Cheyenne. She gave it to me this morning before Uncle Darius found out I was there. She said to bring it to you." Caleb took the envelope. His name was on the front, not his full name. Just Caleb, written in a hand he didn't recognize. He turned it over. The seal had been broken, which meant Emmy had read it, or Widow Hargrove had, or both. "Go ahead," Emmy said. "She told me what it says." He unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages, written close and careful. The handwriting of a man who'd had some schooling and used it sparingly. The man identified himself as Samuel Cole, Emmy's father, who had gone to Cheyenne to file certain legal documents, and had reason to believe he might not make it back before matters at the ranch reached a critical point. He explained briefly, and without self-pity, that his brother Darius had been contesting ownership of the Western Range since their mother's death 2 years prior. That the contest had recently moved from legal maneuvering into something more direct and more frightening, and that he had hidden his copy of their mother's original will in the tack room at the main ranch house, behind the third board on the left wall, in a tin box. He explained that the will designated the Western Range, the main house, and the Mustang herd solely to Samuel and his heirs. He explained that Darius knew this and had been trying by various means to ensure the will never saw the inside of a courtroom. And then, in the last paragraph, in handwriting that was slightly less controlled than the rest, Samuel Cole wrote that if something had happened to him, and if Emmy had made it to Caleb Dawson's house, he was asking Caleb to look after his daughter. He had named Caleb in the documents as Emmy's legal guardian, should Samuel be unable to fulfill that role himself. He had also written, "I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know we are barely more than neighbors who have nodded at each other across a fence line. But Widow Hargrove says you are a good man, and Emmy's mother said the same before she passed, and I have no one else I trust with my daughter's life." Caleb read it twice. Then he folded it back along its original creases and set it on the settle beside Emmy's knee. "Your papa is a careful man," he said. "He knew Uncle Darius would come after me." Emmy's voice was flat, in the way that voices go flat when the speaker has run out of room for fear. "He came last night. I hid in the loft, but he found me this morning and he said—" She stopped, swallowed, started again. "He said I didn't have any rights to anything. He said Papa had probably run off and left me, and that I was his responsibility now, and that I'd better learn to be useful, or he'd find somewhere more appropriate for a useless girl to live. And the whip. That was when I said Papa hadn't run off." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on. He stood at the stove with his back to the door and breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth the way Clara had taught him to do back in the days when his temper had been a problem. Clara had been a patient woman, patient enough to teach a hard-headed man how to feel his anger without letting it make his decisions for him. He hadn't had much cause to practice that skill in 7 years. He was surprised to find it still worked. He made tea. He sweetened it with the last of his sugar, which he'd been rationing since the general store had raised its prices in June, and he brought it back out to Emmy along with what remained of the morning's cornbread. It wasn't much, but it was something. She ate like she hadn't eaten in 2 days, which he suspected was approximately accurate. "How bad was it?" he asked when she'd finished. "The whip." She looked at him. "Do you need to see?" "Only if you're willing." She turned slightly on the settle and lifted the back of her dress far enough that he could see her shoulders. He looked. He said nothing. She let the fabric fall. "All right," he said. "All right what?" "All right, you're staying here." He stood up. "And all right, we're going to figure out what to do about your uncle." Emmy looked at him with those 2 old brown eyes. "You don't have to do that. Papa just asked you to keep me safe. He didn't ask you to fight anybody. Your papa asked me to be your guardian." He picked up the letter and tucked it carefully into his shirt pocket. "Far as I'm concerned, that means making the world safe enough for you to live in it. Fighting whoever needs fighting is part of the arrangement. You could get hurt. I've been hurt before." He picked up the basin and the cloth. "I survived it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Hargrove said you lost your family." He stopped in the doorway to the kitchen but didn't turn around. "I did. She said you haven't been the same since." "She's right." "Are you?" Emmy stopped, started again more carefully. "Are you going to be all right doing this?" He turned around then. She was watching him with an expression he recognized, because he'd seen it in his own mirror during the first year after Clara and Rose had died. That particular combination of needing something desperately and being terrified of wanting it too much. "Emmy," he said, "I have $9 to my name, a carpenter's toolbox, and a bad knee that aches every time the weather changes. I am not, by any conventional measure, the ideal man for this situation." He set down the basin. "But I gave you my word, and I don't break my word, so yes, I'm going to be all right." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked down at her hands in her lap. "Thank you." It came out very small, like she wasn't sure she deserved to say it. "Don't thank me yet. We've got work to do." He went back to the kitchen and started thinking. $9, a carpenter's tools, a bad knee. The law in Harlan County moved at its own pace, which was to say slowly, and in the direction of whoever had the most money. At present, that was Darius Cole. Ward Keller, the county sheriff, was not a corrupt man exactly, but he was a cautious one, and caution in the face of the Cole family's resources had historically translated into a particular kind of blindness. But Darius didn't know the will existed. Or rather, Caleb corrected himself, pulling the letter out again and reading the relevant section. Darius knew there had been a will, because he'd been present when their mother died. But he didn't know where Samuel had hidden his copy, and without the will, without a physical document, the legal case was significantly harder to make in court. The will was in the tack room, third board, left wall, a tin box. He looked out the kitchen window at the sky, which was doing exactly what he'd feared, building up dark and heavy to the west, the kind of clouds that promised serious weather before morning. He looked at the calendar on the wall. Clara had put it up in 1871, and he'd replaced it every year since, out of habit, tearing off the old pages and pinning up the new ones. Probably the most absurd, ongoing project of his widowhood. But there it was. Today was the 9th of August, 1878. He did not have time to wait for the law to catch up. He heard Emmy shift on the settle in the front room, and then he heard her voice quietly asking the empty room a question she didn't expect an answer to. "Are you real?" she said. He thought she was talking to herself, or perhaps to God, or perhaps to the particular kind of hope that 10-year-old girls in desperate situations sometimes directed at the universe. "I'm real," he called back. A pause. "Okay," she said. Just that. Okay. Caleb Dawson folded the letter, put it back in his pocket, and began to plan. He hadn't felt like himself in 7 years. He hadn't felt like much of anything, really. Just a man going through the motions of a life that no longer had much purpose. Building furniture for other people's homes because he needed something to do with his hands, and because the money kept him fed. He'd stopped caring about most things gradually, the way a fire goes out. Not all at once, but in stages. Dimming and dimming until one day there's nothing left but ash. But the letter in his pocket was doing something to him that he hadn't expected. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was anger in it. It wasn't grief, though that was there too, familiar and close. It was something older and more basic than either of those things. It was the feeling of being needed, of being the specific person in the specific place at the specific moment when something important was required of him. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He rolled up his sleeves and started to think in earnest. The Cole ranch was 4 miles east. Darius would know by now that Emmy had run. He'd be looking, but he'd expect her to run north toward town, toward witnesses and civilization. He wouldn't expect her to have gone to Caleb Dawson's property, because there was no reason for Caleb Dawson to be involved in this at all. Not yet. That gave them a window, maybe a day, maybe less if Darius was thorough. They needed the will before that window closed. "Emmy," he called. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, moving carefully, one hand on the frame. She'd found a blanket somewhere, Clara's blue blanket from the trunk in the corner, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You know that ranch," he said. "You grew up on it." "Yes, sir." "The tack room your papa mentioned. How many men does your uncle keep on that property?" She thought about it. Seriously, like a person doing a genuine accounting, not guessing. 4 regulars, she said. Maybe 6 if he called in help when he realized I'd gone. He keeps 2 on the north fence overnight and 1 at the bunkhouse. The main house has Uncle Darius and nobody else after dark. He doesn't like people in the house at night. And the tack room? It's attached to the barn. There's 1 door and 2 windows. The window on the west side doesn't latch right. It never has. Papa always meant to fix it. Caleb looked at her. "You've thought about this before," he said. She met his eyes. "I've been thinking about it since Papa left." 7 years of grief had made Caleb Dawson a man who expected very little from the world. He had stopped being surprised by cruelty because cruelty had become familiar. He had stopped being surprised by kindness because kindness had mostly stopped reaching him in quantities worth noticing. But this child, 10 years old, barefoot, welted and bruised and exhausted, had walked 4 miles on bleeding feet to bring him a letter and a plan. And now she was standing in his kitchen doorway with Clara's blanket around her shoulders, explaining guard rotations like a small, solemn general. He felt something shift in his chest, something he'd thought was permanently sealed. "All right," he said. "Here's what we're going to do." Caleb told Emmy to sleep. She didn't argue, which told him how far past her limit she already was. He watched her settle onto the settle with Clara's blanket pulled to her chin. He watched her eyes close. And he watched her body do that particular thing that exhausted children's bodies do, going from rigid and guarded to deeply, completely limp inside of about 4 minutes. He stood in the kitchen doorway and went to work. He had a lantern, half a tin of coal oil, a coil of rope that was mostly sound, a skinning knife that needed sharpening, and a Colt revolver he hadn't fired in 3 years. He found the revolver in the bottom of the trunk at the foot of the bed, under the folded clothes he hadn't moved since Clara died. He held it in his hands for a moment and felt the weight of it and thought about what it meant to pick something like that back up. He cleaned it, loaded it, put it in his belt. Then he sat at the kitchen table and drew a rough map from memory of the Cole Ranch as he understood it. He compared that to what Emmy had told him, corrected it in several places, and sat looking at it until the candle burned down to a stub and the night outside had gone fully black and quiet. The rain had held off. That was something. He woke Emmy at 2 in the morning. He didn't have to wake her hard. She came alert fast, the way people do when they've been sleeping in dangerous places long enough that safety stops being their default assumption. "Is it time?" she said. "Getting close." He set a cup of water on the settle beside her. "I need to ask you something first." She sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "All right. Your uncle's men, you said 4 regulars, maybe 6 if he called for help. Do you know their names?" "Briggs and Fowler are the ones he trusts. The others are hired hands. They work for pay, not loyalty." Papa always said Briggs and Fowler were the ones to worry about. "Briggs and Fowler," Caleb repeated. "Do they know you? Would they recognize you in the dark?" Emmy's expression went careful. "Yes. Briggs is the one who—" She stopped. "He's the one who held my arms." "When Darius used the whip?" "Yes," he nodded. "Then we go around the north pasture, not the south road. It's longer, but it keeps us away from the bunkhouse." "That's what I would have done," she said, "if I'd gone back alone." "You're not going back alone. You're taking me with you." "I thought you'd leave me here. You know where the board is. You know which window doesn't latch. You know the dog's name and whether it bites or just barks." He picked up the coil of rope. "I'd be walking in blind without you. But you stay close, and you do what I say when I say it. And if I tell you to run, you run and you don't stop. Understood?" Emmy stood up and let the blanket fall. She'd found a dark shawl in the trunk earlier, Clara's wool shawl, the dark brown one, and had it folded over her arm. She put it around her shoulders now without being told, because she'd already understood that dark colors mattered on a night like this. "Understood," she said. They went out the back. The night was warm and smelled like rain coming. That particular electric smell that settles over Wyoming in August when the sky is thinking about opening up. Caleb moved carefully, testing his bad knee on the uneven ground, keeping his hand back to check Emmy's pace every 50 feet or so. She moved quietly. Better than quietly. She moved like someone who'd had practice moving without being heard. That told him something about the kind of month she'd been living through. They didn't speak for the better part of an hour. The land east of Caleb's property rolled into low scrub and creek-bed willows before opening up again into the Cole Range. They picked their way through it by starlight and instinct, Emmy slightly ahead once they crossed onto territory she knew. "The dog," Caleb said quietly when they could see the outline of the barn ahead. "Where does he sleep?" "By the kitchen door, west side of the main house." "We're going to the barn. He won't come that far unless he hears something." "What's his name?" "Jasper." "Does he know you?" "He loves me." She said it without sentimentality, just as fact. "He'd come to me if he heard me, and that would make noise." "Then we're quiet." They reached the barn wall and pressed against it. Caleb listened. He could hear one of the horses shifting inside, and the distant sound of the north fence wind in the wire. Nothing else. No voices. No footsteps. The 2 men on the north fence were far enough away that they wouldn't see the barn door unless they were looking directly at it. "The window," he said. Emmy moved along the wall to the second window. She put her hands on the frame and pushed. It gave, swinging inward on a hinge that whispered rather than creaked. She looked back at him. He boosted her up and through, and she dropped inside without a sound. A moment later, she had the barn door open from the inside. Not wide, just enough for a man to pass through sideways. Inside, the dark was total. Caleb stood still and let his eyes adjust, listening to the horses settle back into their nighttime quiet. There were 4 of them in the stalls, and one of them, a gray near the far wall, raised its head and looked at him with calm curiosity before losing interest. "Third board," Emmy said very close to his ear. "Left wall." He felt along the wall with his hands. Old wood, rough and dry. He counted the boards from the corner. 1, 2, 3. He pressed. The board flexed slightly at the top. He got his fingers behind it and pulled. It came away from its peg with a soft scrape of wood on wood. Behind it, a tin box about the size of a Bible. He got it out and handed it to Emmy, who held it against her chest with both arms like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever touched. Which, in every meaningful sense, it was. "Open it," she said. "Not here. We open it at home, with light, so we can read what we've got." "But what if it's not?" He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. "It's there. Your father knew what he was doing. We take it home, we read it properly, and then we know what we're working with." She held the box tighter and nodded. That was when they heard the voices. 2 men coming around the south side of the barn, not hurrying, but not idle either. The kind of walk that meant someone had been sent to check something specific. Caleb pulled Emmy back against the far wall without a word and put himself between her and the door. Said he saw a light near the Dawson property. That was a voice Caleb didn't recognize. Young, a little nervous. "Darius wants the whole perimeter checked." "There's no light," a second voice, older, flat, dismissive. "Weather's making everybody jumpy." "I'm just saying what Darius said, and I'm saying if Darius thinks that little girl walked 4 miles in the dark with busted feet to hide at some broken-down carpenter's place, he's giving her a lot more credit than she deserves." The older voice paused. "Check the barn door, then let's get back." Caleb pressed Emmy farther behind him and put his back to the wall beside the door. The barn door moved. It opened 3 inches, then stopped. The man on the other side held his lantern up, and the light swept across the center of the barn floor in a wide arc. It missed the far wall where Caleb and Emmy stood by a matter of feet. One of the horses shuffled. The lantern held. Then the older voice said, "Horses are settled. Door's fine." "Come on." The light withdrew. The door pulled shut. Footsteps moving away south and then west, diminishing into the dark. Emmy had not made a sound. She had not moved. She had barely breathed. Caleb turned to look at her in the near darkness. She looked back at him. He could see in the set of her mouth and the steadiness of her eyes that she had made a decision somewhere in the last 3 inches of lantern light. A decision about fear, about whether she was going to let it own her, or whether she was going to carry it and keep moving. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They went back out the window. They made it to the edge of the Cole property before the trouble came from a direction Caleb hadn't anticipated. He heard the horse before he saw it. Hooves on hard ground, coming from the east, moving fast for this hour of the night. He put his arm out and stopped Emmy on instinct. They pressed into the shadow of a stand of scrub willow and waited. The rider pulled up 20 feet from them and called out, not loud but clear, to someone Caleb couldn't see yet. "Briggs! Hey, Briggs!" Another set of hoofbeats, slower, coming from the north. The man called Briggs. "What is it?" "Darius wants you at the house. Word came back from Cheyenne." A pause. "What kind of word?" "The kind that changes things." The first rider's voice dropped, but the night was still enough to carry it. "Samuel Cole is dead. Fell from his horse on the Cheyenne road, they're saying. But Darius ain't saying that's how it happened. He wants all the papers in the house before morning, and he wants to know where the girl is." Caleb did not move. He felt Emmy go rigid beside him, a full-body stillness that was worse than any sound she could have made. He put his hand on her arm and kept it there, steady and firm, and felt her trembling against his palm. Her father was dead. The riders moved off toward the main house. Caleb waited until he couldn't hear them anymore, and then he waited another 2 minutes. Then he turned to Emmy. She was looking at the ground. Her shoulders were shaking. "Emmy." She looked up. Her eyes were dry. She had gone somewhere behind them. That place children go when the worst thing happens and the body decides that falling apart is a luxury it cannot currently afford. "Fell from his horse," she said. "I heard." "Papa doesn't fall from horses." Her voice was completely flat. "He's been riding since he was 5 years old. He doesn't fall." "No," Caleb said. "I don't reckon he does." She held the tin box tighter. "Is that why he sent the letter? Because he knew something might happen to him? I think your papa was a man who planned for things he hoped wouldn't happen. That's not weakness. That's love." She breathed. It was a careful, controlled breath, the kind that is doing enormous work behind the scenes. "Darius killed him." "I don't know that yet." "I do." She looked up at him with those old, clear brown eyes. "I've known what kind of man my uncle is for a long time. So did Papa." Caleb thought about the letter in his shirt pocket. "I know I have no right to ask this of you." Samuel Cole had written that sentence knowing, or at least suspecting, that he might be writing it with very little time left. He'd sent his daughter into the Wyoming night with a broken heart and a plan and a name. And that name had been Caleb Dawson. A man he barely knew, because there was no one else. Caleb felt the weight of that in a way that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with obligation. "Here's what I know," he said. "Your father named me your guardian in those documents, and those documents are in that box. And that means, starting right now, tonight, you are my responsibility and my family. And Darius Cole can want whatever he wants to want, but he is going to have to come through me to get to you. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She looked at him for a long moment. "You mean it?" It wasn't a question exactly. "I mean every word. Even though Papa is—" She stopped. The word wouldn't come. "Even so," he said. "Maybe especially because of that." She made a sound then, just one, small and tight, like something escaping through a crack she hadn't intended to leave open. Then she pressed her lips together and lifted her chin. Caleb watched her make the same decision Clara had made 100 times over the years, the decision to grieve later and act now, because the situation required it. "Then let's go home," Emmy said. They made it back to his property before the first suggestion of gray in the east. Caleb got Emmy settled at the kitchen table with the lantern lit and the tin box in front of her. He sat across from her, and they opened it together. The will was there. 2 pages, formal and clear, witnessed by a notary in Laramie, dated 3 years prior. Everything Emmy had said it contained was there. The western range, the main house, the mustang herd, all of it designated to Samuel Cole outright. And at the bottom, in a separate addendum dated 6 months ago, Samuel had added a provision for Emmy's guardianship, naming Caleb Dawson specifically, with a second notary's signature beside his own. Caleb read the addendum twice. Samuel Cole had arranged all of this 6 months ago, had planned it, had it witnessed, had hidden it away, and had trusted Widow Hargrove with the directions to find it. A man who had been watching the danger build for months and had done everything a careful man could do to protect his daughter in his absence. "He planned all of this," Emmy said. She was reading over Caleb's arm, her finger tracing the notary's seal. "He knew. He did everything right," Caleb said. "And because he did, you're going to be all right. Will the law honor it?" Her voice was careful, practical. She'd been thinking about this already. Darius has money. He has men. "Sheriff Keller. Ward Keller is a cautious man, but he's not a dishonest one." Caleb set the pages down flat on the table and looked at them. "What he is a man who needs something solid in front of him before he'll act. And this," he pressed 2 fingers lightly to the will, "this is solid. This is a notarized legal document signed by a Laramie attorney. Keller can't ignore it. He won't. He might try to wait." "He might," Caleb stood. "That's why we're not waiting for him to come to us." Emmy looked up. "As soon as it's light," he said, "I'm going to ride to Widow Hargrove's place and to Doc Crane's. I need witnesses who knew your condition when you arrived. I need medical documentation of your injuries, because that's evidence of what Darius has been doing. That's separate from any property dispute. And then I'm going to Ward Keller's office with this will and those witnesses, and I am going to stand in his doorway until he does his job." He looked at her. "And you're coming with me every step. You're the evidence, Emmy. You're walking proof that those documents matter. Nobody's leaving you alone while Darius Cole has men looking." She absorbed this. Then she said, "Caleb, I don't have anywhere to go. After all of this, I mean. Even if the ranch is mine by law, I'm 10. I can't run a ranch." "You don't have to run it yet." He started for the back room to get his good coat. "That's what I'm for." There was a long silence. Then Emmy said quietly from the kitchen table, "Papa picked the right man." Caleb stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. "He gave me the chance to be," he said. "That's all any of us can ask." He went to get the coat. Outside the window, the eastern sky was turning from black to gray to the first faint blush of something that might eventually become morning. But in his chest, the cold stone was still there, because the news from the road hadn't faded. Samuel Cole was dead. And the man who had done it was still out there, still in power, still looking for the girl who held the only document that could take everything from him. Dawn was coming, but the night wasn't over yet. The gray light of early morning stretched across the Wyoming sky like a slow bruise as Caleb Dawson lifted Emmy onto the back of Bess and handed her the tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands were still trembling, but they held the box as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. In a way, it was. They rode out before the first rooster crowed in the yard behind the house, and Caleb made himself check every instinct that wanted to twist around and look over his shoulder. Darius Cole had not come for them during the night. That meant he was planning something else. A man like Darius did not sit still after losing a card he thought he held. He reshuffled. He dealt again. And Caleb had the cold feeling that the next hand was already being laid out on a table somewhere in the shadows of Harlan County. The road to Widow Hargrove's place was 4 miles of rutted, dusty track that wound through the southern edge of the scrubland. Bess knew it well enough to find it half asleep, and the silence between Caleb and Emmy had the weight of things unsaid. He wanted to ask her how she was holding up, what she was thinking, but every time he opened his mouth, the words felt too small for the moment. So they rode in the rhythm of hoofbeats and creaking leather, and the morning began to warm around them. Nettie Hargrove was already on her porch when they came around the last bend. 71 years old, built like a fence post, and twice as stubborn. She had a shotgun across her knees that she lowered exactly 1 inch when she recognized Caleb's mare. Her eyes went straight to Emmy, and something in her face softened, then hardened again with the efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that grief was a luxury to be rationed. "I've been waiting since midnight," she said. "Figured you'd either come to me or Darius Cole's men would. Glad it was you." Caleb helped Emmy down from the saddle, and the girl walked to the porch with the careful, deliberate steps of someone whose feet were still not fully healed. She held the tin box in front of her with both arms, and when she reached Nettie, she stood there without speaking, just looking at her. Nettie looked back. Then she set the shotgun aside and opened the door. "Get in here, both of you. I've got biscuits and something to tell you that won't wait." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and coffee that had been sitting on the stove since before dawn. Nettie moved with the unhurried authority of a woman who owned her space completely. She set a plate of biscuits on the table and poured 2 cups of coffee, one for Caleb and one for Emmy, with a generous splash of milk. "You got the will," Nettie said. It was not a question. Caleb unwrapped the oilcloth and set the tin box on the table. Emmy opened it and lifted out the papers, handling them with the same reverence she had used in Caleb's kitchen. She laid the pages flat in front of Nettie, side by side, and stood back. Nettie read in silence. She took her time, reading each line, checking the notary seals, the dates, the signatures. When she finished, she looked up at Caleb with an expression that made him feel like he had passed some test he hadn't known he was taking. "Samuel did it right," she said. "This is airtight, far as I can tell. And the guardianship provision, he had that witnessed separate, which means it can't be challenged on technicalities." "That's what I thought," Caleb said. "But I need you to come with us to Doc Crane's and then to Ward Keller's office. I need your statement about Emmy's condition when she arrived here." "I already wrote it." Nettie reached into the sideboard drawer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Everything I observed, with the date and time, and my signature at the bottom." She laid it on the table beside the will. "Clara always said you were stubborn as a post, Caleb Dawson, but she also said you were thorough. Be thorough today." Caleb picked up the paper and read it. Nettie's handwriting was small and precise, and she had recorded every detail she had seen. The bruising, the welts, the bleeding feet, the torn dress, the leaves in Emmy's hair. She had even noted the look in the girl's eyes, the flatness of someone who has been hurt so often that fear has become a background noise. "This is good," Caleb said. "This is more than good." "It's the truth," Nettie said, "and that's what we're going to need, because I heard from Ray Tibbs last night that Darius was in town until well past dark. He went to Ward Keller's house, not the office, the house. He was there for close to 2 hours. Caleb set down his coffee cup. That's not a courtesy call. No, it is not. Nettie crossed her arms. Ray saw Darius come out, and he said Darius looked satisfied. And Darius Cole does not look satisfied unless he's gotten something he wanted. Emmy spoke for the first time since they had entered the house. He's already told the sheriff his version. Most likely, Nettie said. Which means when you walk into Keller's office this morning, Keller's already heard a story. And the story he heard wasn't yours. Caleb thought about Ward Keller. He had known the man for 15 years, had built the bookshelves in his front room and the cabinet in his office. Keller was not corrupt, but he was cautious. And cautious men who had heard one side of a story first had a way of treating the second side as the one that required proof. Then we bring proof, Caleb said. Nettie, I need you to come with us to Doc Crane's first, and then to Keller's office. I need you to tell him in person what you've written here. I'll do more than that, Nettie said. She went to the sideboard and came back with a second folded paper. This is a statement from me as a witness to Emmy's arrival and condition, including my observation that the injuries were fresh and consistent with deliberate abuse. It's notarized by Harold Fitch at the land office. I rode in yesterday evening before Darius got there and had him witness it. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. He had known Nettie Hargrove was capable, but this level of preparation was beyond what he had expected. You thought of everything, he said. I thought of what I'd want someone to do for me if I was in Emmy's place, Nettie said. That's not the same as everything, but it's a start. They rode out again 20 minutes later, Emmy riding double with Caleb, Nettie following in her buggy with the 2 statements and the will copy in a leather satchel under her arm. The sun had climbed well above the horizon now, and the August heat was already building. Flies buzzed around the horses' ears, and the dust from the road settled on their clothes and in their throats. The world felt ordinary. That was the strange part. The sky was blue, the grass was brown, and somewhere in the middle of all this ordinariness, a man was dead and a child was fighting for her home. Doc Crane's house and surgery sat at the edge of town, a white clapboard building with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side and a sign that read, Dr. E.J. Crane, in letters that had been painted over so many times they looked like they were carved into the wood. Doc Crane was a small, precise man of 50-something, with spectacles and hands that were always clean no matter what time of day you found him. He had practiced medicine in Harlan County for 20 years, and he had the particular manner of someone who had seen enough human damage to be matter-of-fact about it without being unkind. He took one look at Emmy when they walked through his door and said, "Sit down, child," in a tone that allowed no argument. The examination took 40 minutes. Doc Crane worked methodically, documenting every injury, measuring each welt, recording the stage of healing for each bruise. He asked Emmy questions in a voice that was gentle but professional, and she answered in the same flat, careful tone she had used with Caleb. When he got to the damage on her back, he paused for a long moment, then continued without comment. But Caleb saw the set of his jaw, and he knew that the report would be thorough. When it was done, Doc Crane washed his hands at the basin and turned to Caleb. The welts on her back and arm are consistent with an abraded leather implement. The bruising on her face is from a closed fist. The lacerations on her feet are consistent with extended walking over rough terrain without footwear. He paused. The injuries to her back are not recent. There are at least 3 distinct stages of healing that I can identify, which means this has been happening over a period of weeks, not days. Caleb kept his face even. Will you put that in writing? I already am. Doc Crane was at his desk, writing with the same precision he applied to everything. I'll have a signed medical statement ready in 10 minutes. And Caleb, he looked up, I want to testify if it comes to that. This child should not have been treated this way. Not by anyone. Not for any reason. I'm hoping it doesn't come to a trial, Caleb said. I'm hoping the documents are enough to settle this legally and quickly. Doc Crane shook his head slowly. Darius Cole does not settle. He accumulates. He waits. He finds the crack, and he works it open. If he can't win in a courtroom, he'll find another way. Caleb had known that already. but hearing it from a man who had lived in Harlan County as long as Doc Crane made it land differently. He looked at Emmy, who had put her dress back on and was sitting on the examination table with the tin box in her lap, watching the two men with those old, clear eyes. She was waiting. That was all she could do. They left Doc Crane's with the medical report folded into Nettie's satchel, and they rode the final stretch into the main street of Harlan County. The clock on the courthouse showed 8:30. The day was still young, but it already felt like they had lived through a week. The sheriff's office was a squat stone building at the end of the street, with a wooden awning that cast a thin stripe of shade across the boardwalk. Caleb tied Bess at the rail and lifted Emmy down. Nettie parked her buggy and hitched it beside them, and the three of them stood in the morning light for a moment, gathering themselves. "You ready?" Caleb asked Emmy. She looked up at him. "No, but I'm going in anyway." He nodded. That was all he needed to hear. Ward Keller was at his desk when they entered. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with a gray mustache he'd had since before Caleb met him, and a habit of lacing his fingers together on the desktop when he was thinking. He was doing that now. He looked up when they came in, and something moved across his face, there and gone too fast to name precisely. Surprise, perhaps, or wariness. "Caleb," he said. "Ward," Caleb set the oilcloth packet on the desk. "I need about 20 minutes of your time, and I need you to listen with an open mind. Can you do that for me?" Keller looked at Emmy, who had come in behind Caleb and was standing very straight beside him, with her hands clasped in front of her. His gaze lingered on the bruise on her face, and something shifted in his expression, harder to read than before. "This is Emmy Cole," Caleb said. "Samuel Cole's daughter. I expect you've heard about Samuel." "I heard this morning," Keller said carefully. "Then you know she's alone in the world. And I expect you've also heard Darius Cole's version of the relevant facts, given that he was at your house until 10 o'clock last night." Keller's expression flickered. Not guilt exactly. More like a man recalibrating. "He came to inform me about his brother's accident." "I'm sure he did." Caleb opened the oilcloth and laid the will on the desk, then Nettie's written statement, then Doc Crane's medical report. He set them out one at a time, like cards in a careful hand. "That's Samuel Cole's will, notarized in Laramie, witnessed by two parties, designating Emmy as his heir and me as her legal guardian. That's Widow Hargrove's sworn written account of Emmy's condition when she arrived at her house yesterday before coming to me. And that is Doc Crane's medical statement on the nature, severity, and approximate timeline of Emmy's injuries." Keller looked at the documents without touching them. "Caleb, Ward." Caleb's voice was quiet and even. "I've known you for 15 years. I've sat at your table and built shelves for your front room, and I've never once asked you for a favor. I'm not asking for one now. I'm presenting you with legal documentation of a crime and a child who has the injuries to prove it, and I'm asking you to do your job." The room was very quiet. Keller picked up the will and read it. Then he read it again. Then he picked up Doc Crane's report and read that. Nettie Hargrove appeared in the doorway, still holding her satchel, and stood there without a word. Keller set the documents down. He looked at Emmy directly for the first time. "Emmy, did your uncle do this to you?" Emmy looked back at him without blinking. "Yes, sir, he did." "And you witnessed this?" Keller looked at Nettie. "I witnessed the results of it," Nettie said. "That child came to me with those injuries, and I gave her what she needed to get to Caleb. I'd do it again." Keller rubbed his hand across his face. He looked like a man doing a calculation he didn't particularly enjoy, but doing it honestly. "The will is legitimate. The guardianship is clear." He looked at Caleb. "You understand that Darius Cole is going to contest this?" "Let him contest it in court," Caleb said. "That's what courts are for. All I'm asking you to do today is enforce what's already legally established. If I ride out to the Cole ranch and serve papers, I'll need deputies." "I'll ride with you," Caleb said. "So will I," said Nettie. Keller looked at them both. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, the way large men move when they've made up their minds, and reached for his hat. "Give me an hour to get the emergency filing drawn up. Then yes, we ride." The hour felt like 3. Caleb sat on the bench outside the sheriff's office with Emmy beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He could feel the tension in her, the way you feel weather coming, not visible yet, but present in every nerve. He might not honor it, Emmy said quietly. Darius, even if the sheriff comes. He might not, Caleb agreed. Then what? Then Ward Keller arrests him for obstruction, and we take it before a judge. And the legal record shows that Darius Cole refused to comply with a lawful order. That's what I thought. She was quiet for a moment. Then what's the worst thing that can happen? Caleb turned to look at her. She was staring straight ahead at the dusty street, her hands flat on her knees. He thought about the question carefully before answering. The worst thing is that Darius finds a way to drag this out for months, that he uses his money and his connections to keep the case tied up in legal arguments long enough that people forget. That he wears us down through time and cost because he can afford to wait, and we can't. But we have the will. We have the witnesses. We have the medical report. We do, Caleb said. And in a fair world, that would be enough. But the law moves slowly when the man on the other side has money, and there's a difference between being right and being able to prove it in time to matter. Emmy absorbed that. Then she said, "Are you scared?" The honest answer was yes, in the specific way that honest men are scared before necessary confrontations. Not cowardice, but the body's accurate understanding that things can go wrong. But he had made a decision in his kitchen 2 nights ago, when he had picked up the Colt and loaded it and put it in his belt. That decision was still holding. "A little," he said. "You?" "More than a little." She looked down at her hands. "But I'm more scared of what happens if we don't do this than what happens if we do." "That's courage," Caleb said. "That's exactly what courage is." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Caleb, when all this is over, whatever way it goes, I want to do right by the mustangs. Papa loved that herd. He said they were the last free thing left on the range, and somebody had to stand between them and the men who'd break them." Caleb thought about Clara's garden, growing tomatoes out of sheer biological persistence, and the way he had been keeping it going for 7 years for no reason he could fully articulate. Some things are worth standing for just because they're worth standing for. Your papa understood that. She nodded, and he could see her filing it away somewhere deep inside, into the place where people keep the things that sustain them through the worst of what's coming. Ward Keller came out of his office at 10 minutes before 10, papers in hand, and they rode for the Cole ranch. The sun was high now, and the heat shimmered off the road in waves. Nettie stayed close in her buggy, and Caleb kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for dust trails or movement. They were 2 miles out when they saw the riders. 5 men, coming fast from the east, spread wide in a formation that meant they had been sent out with specific instructions. Keller pulled up his horse and watched them approach. "How many do you count?" he asked. 5, Caleb said. "Briggs and Fowler," Emmy said. Her voice was steady. "And 3 others I don't know." The riders reached them and spread in a rough arc across the road. The man at the center was not Darius Cole. That meant Darius was somewhere else, doing something else, while his men managed the road. The thought landed in Caleb's gut like a cold stone. The man at the center was big, dark-bearded, with a rifle laid across his saddle. He looked at Keller first. "Sheriff, Mr. Cole asks that you turn back. He says any legal matters can be addressed through his attorney in Laramie." "That's not how this works, Briggs," Keller said. "Mr. Cole says it is. Mr. Cole doesn't get to decide how the law works in my county." Keller held up the papers. "I have a court order and a valid will and a minor child under legal guardianship. I am proceeding to the Cole Ranch to serve these documents. You can ride back and tell Darius that, or you can get out of my way. Either way, I'm going through." Briggs looked at the papers. Then he looked at Emmy. Something moved in his face when he saw her. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who knows what he has participated in and has decided not to examine it too closely. "She's a Cole," he said. "She belongs with her family." "She belongs with her legal guardian," Caleb said. He had not spoken until now, and the quietness of his voice in contrast to the tension of the moment seemed to land harder than volume would have. "Which is me. That's established in law, witnessed by a notary, and sitting right there in the sheriff's hand. You want to argue with it? You hire a lawyer, and you argue it in court. But today, on this road, you're going to move." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Caleb looked back. He did not reach for the Colt. He did not move his hand toward it. He simply held Briggs's gaze with the specific kind of steadiness that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having already counted the cost and decided it was worth paying. One of the men behind Briggs shifted in his saddle. Not Fowler, one of the others. Younger, whose horse was sidling sideways in that nervous way horses have when they pick up something from their riders. "Briggs," the young man said quietly. Briggs looked at the papers again, then at Keller, then at Caleb, and finally at Emmy. Whatever he saw in her face, a 10-year-old girl looking back at him with absolutely no fear in her eyes, made something in his jaw go tight. He reined his horse sideways. "We're not done," he said to Caleb. "Probably not," Caleb agreed. The road cleared. They rode on. But Caleb kept his hand close to his coat for the rest of the ride. The cold stone in his gut was telling him that Darius Cole had not sent his men to stop them on the road. He had sent them to slow them down. And while 5 men were slowing them down on the road, Darius Cole was somewhere else. The question of where he was and what he was doing had started to feel urgent in a way that Caleb did not like at all. They came over the last rise and saw the Cole ranch below them. Caleb's hand moved to the Colt without him deciding it, because there were horses at the main house that had not been there this morning, and there was smoke from the kitchen chimney, though it was too late in the day for a kitchen fire, and there was a figure on the porch who was not a ranch hand. Darius Cole was waiting for them. He had been there the whole time. Darius Cole was not what Caleb had expected. That was itself a kind of warning. He had built a picture in his mind over the past 24 hours. A brutal man, a big man, the kind of man whose cruelty was written in his size and his voice and the way he moved through a room. What he saw on that porch was something more dangerous than that. Darius Cole was lean and composed, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had learned a long time ago to show exactly what it chose to show, and nothing else. He was dressed well. He held a cup of coffee in one hand like he was receiving guests on a Sunday morning. He smiled when he saw them come over the rise. That smile told Caleb everything he needed to know about how this man had operated for so long without consequence. "Ward," Darius said pleasantly as Keller rode into the yard. "I figured you'd come out. Saved you the trouble of sending word." He looked at Caleb. "Dawson, I don't believe we've met formally." "We haven't," Caleb said. "And Emmy." Darius's smile did not change, but something behind it did, a flicker of cold and calculating that came and went so fast Emmy might have missed it. She did not miss it. Caleb felt her hands tighten where they gripped his arm from behind the saddle. "I'm glad you're safe, sweetheart. I've had men looking for you since yesterday. You had me worried." "Mr. Cole," Keller said, and his voice was doing the careful work of a man who had decided to be professional, regardless of what he was feeling. "I have documents here that need to be served. I'd appreciate your cooperation." "Of course." Darius set down his coffee cup on the porch rail and descended the steps with the easy confidence of a man who had already won and was now simply managing the formality of the other side figuring it out. "Let me see what you've got." Keller handed him the papers. Darius read them slowly, and his face did not change at all. That was, in itself, a performance, because no man reads a legal document establishing that his dead brother's child owns the ranch he has been trying to claim for 2 years and feels nothing. The nothing on Darius Cole's face was a choice, and a practiced one. "This will," Darius said, finally holding it up slightly, "is dated 3 years ago." "That's correct," Keller said. "My mother's estate was settled 18 months ago." The settlement superseded any prior arrangements. He folded the papers with deliberate care and held them back out to Keller. "I have the settlement documents in the house, filed with the Laramie court, signed by a judge. I'd be happy to show them to you." Caleb got down from the saddle. He did it slowly, with intention, so that Darius could see it happening and understand what it meant. "Ward," he said, "don't take those papers back." Keller looked at him. A settlement of an estate does not invalidate a prior will unless the will was specifically named and contested in that settlement. Was Samuel Cole present at the settlement hearing? Did he contest it? Or did the settlement happen while Samuel was contesting the ranch through other means, and you simply did not tell the court a valid will existed. Something moved in Darius's eyes, just for a moment. "You're a carpenter," Darius said. "I can read," Caleb said. "And I've read that will 3 times. It's sound." "Mr. Cole," Keller said, his voice firmer now, "I'm going to need to see those settlement documents." "Certainly." Darius turned toward the house. "Come inside. I'll have my man find them." "We'll wait here," Caleb said. Darius paused with his back to them. A brief pause, barely perceptible. Then he turned around and looked at Caleb with an expression that had stopped pretending to be pleasant. "You have no standing here, Dawson." "The guardianship provision gives me standing." Caleb reached into his coat and produced his copy of the will. He had kept it separate from the packet he had given Keller deliberately. "Emmy Cole is my legal ward. Her interests are my interests. Her property is under my protection until she comes of age. That's established in law, and you know it." Emmy spoke from behind him. She had climbed down from Bess while Caleb was talking and had moved to stand slightly to his left, not behind him, beside him. Her voice, when it came, was the clearest thing in the yard. "Where's my father's body, Uncle Darius?" The yard went quiet. It was the question nobody had said out loud yet, and the asking of it by a 10-year-old girl with welts on her arm and a bruise on her face landed in the silence like a hammer. Darius looked at her. "Emmy, sweetheart, your father had an accident." "Papa didn't fall from horses." She kept her eyes on his face. "You know that." "Everyone who knew him knows that. He'd been riding since before you were much older than I am." She held his gaze. "I'm asking where his body is because he deserves a proper burial, and you're the one who had men on the Cheyenne Road." "That is a serious accusation," Darius said very quietly. "It's a question," Emmy said. "If you didn't do anything wrong, it should be easy to answer." Caleb watched Darius Cole look at his 10-year-old niece and calculate. He could see the calculation happening. How much this child knew, how much she could prove, how much damage she could do simply by standing in a sheriff's yard and asking questions in that clear, steady voice. "Ward," Darius said, turning to Keller, "I'd like to speak with my attorney before this goes any further." "That's your right," Keller said. He took the papers firmly back from Darius's hand. "But the will stands until a court says otherwise, and the guardianship stands with it. Emmy Cole goes with Caleb Dawson today. That's not negotiable." He tucked the papers into his coat. "Bring the settlement documents to my office in town by end of day. If they supersede the will, a judge will make that determination. Until then, this child stays with her legal guardian." Darius looked at Keller for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then, finally, he looked at Emmy. There was something in that look that made Caleb shift his weight forward slightly. Not a threat, exactly, but a readiness. "Fine," Darius said. He said it like a man setting something down that he intended to pick back up. "For now." He went back inside and closed the door. The yard breathed again. Nettie Hargrove, who had stayed in her buggy through the entire exchange with the stillness of a woman conserving her energy for what mattered, spoke for the first time. "That man has no intention of going to your office, Ward." "No," Keller agreed, "he doesn't." "Then what happens now?" Emmy said. Keller looked at the closed door of the ranch house, then at the men in the yard, the hired hands hanging back at the fence and the bunkhouse doorway, watching. Not Briggs, not Fowler, the others, the ones who worked for pay, not loyalty. "Now," Keller said, "I post one of my deputies at the end of the road. I send a wire to the circuit judge in Laramie. And I build a legal case that does not depend on Darius Cole's cooperation." "He'll find something," Caleb said. "He'll try." Keller gathered his reins. "But trying and succeeding are two different things. Let's get Emmy back to your place and get that wire sent." They were halfway down the ranch road when the sound of a horse coming fast from behind made Caleb turn in the saddle. It was one of the hired hands, the young one from the road, the one whose horse had been sidling. He rode up alongside them and pulled his horse in without ceremony, looking at Keller. "Sheriff," he was breathing hard. "My name's Pete Aldis. I've been working this ranch for 3 months. He glanced back toward the main house, then forward again. "I want to talk to you. Not here. Not with Briggs watching." Keller studied him. "About what?" Pete Aldis looked at Emmy, then at Caleb, then back at Keller. "About the Cheyenne Road," he said, "and what I saw 3 days ago." The cold stone in Caleb's gut turned over. He did not speak. He simply held his hand out to Emmy behind him, and she took it without being asked. They rode on, and Pete Aldous rode with them, and the weight of what he had to say seemed to settle over the group like the heat of the August sun, pressing down, heavy and inescapable, with no shade in sight. Pete Aldous sat in the chair across from Ward Keller's desk, with his hat in his hands, and his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall somewhere above the sheriff's left shoulder. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say, and was now discovering that the actual saying of it was harder than the rehearsal. Caleb stood by the window with his arms crossed, watching the street, keeping one eye on the door. Emmy sat on the bench against the far wall, with the tin box in her lap, and her back straight, and she watched Pete Aldous with the same patient, unblinking attention she had given every adult who had spoken about her father since the news arrived. Keller had his pen ready over a fresh sheet of paper. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Tell me what you saw and when you saw it." Pete nodded. He was a young man, maybe 23, with the kind of face that had not yet settled into its final shape. His hands were calloused from rope work, and there was a fresh cut on his knuckles that he kept covering with his thumb, as if he was unaware he was doing it. 3 days ago," he said, "Wednesday morning. I was mucking out the stalls in the barn, and Darius come in and told Briggs and Fowler to saddle up. He said they had a ride to make and they needed to leave before noon. I didn't think nothing of it at the time. There's always rides to make on a ranch that size. But there was something in the way he said it. Quiet. Like he didn't want anyone else to hear, even though he was standing right there in the barn doorway." He paused and swallowed. "I finished the stalls and went to the tack room to put away the pitchfork. Fowler was in there, getting his rifle down from the rack. He didn't see me at first. I heard him say to Briggs," he thought Briggs was right behind him, "Darius says Samuel's on the Cheyenne Road coming back tomorrow. Says we're to meet him at the cut where the road bends through the bluffs. Make it look like a fall." The words hung in the air like smoke. Emmy did not move. She did not make a sound, but her hands tightened on the tin box until her knuckles went white. "What did you do then?" Keller asked. His voice was carefully neutral. "I backed out of the tack room and went back to the barn and finished my work like I hadn't heard nothing. I didn't know what else to do. I'd only been on that ranch 6 weeks. I didn't know who I could trust or what would happen if Darius found out I'd overheard." Pete looked down at his hands. "I told myself I must have heard wrong, that maybe Fowler was talking about something else, or maybe I'd misheard the name. I wanted it to be a mistake, but it wasn't a mistake," Keller said. "No, sir, it wasn't." Pete's voice dropped. "They rode out around 1 in the afternoon. I saw them go. It was just the two of them, Briggs and Fowler. They took the eastern trail, not the main road. That's the longer way to the Cheyenne Road, but it keeps you out of sight from the open range." "When did they come back?" "Thursday morning, before light. I was up because one of the mares was due to foal, and I was checking on her." Pete's jaw tightened. "I heard horses coming, and I looked out through the crack in the barn door. Briggs and Fowler came in from the east trail again. They were riding hard, and when they pulled up at the bunkhouse, I saw Briggs get off his horse. His sleeve was wet, and in the lantern light, I could see it was blood. Not a lot, but enough to be noticeable. I saw him look down at it and then roll his sleeve up to cover it." "Did he see you watching?" "No, sir. I stayed in the barn until they'd gone into the bunkhouse and the light went out. Then I went back to the mare and pretended I hadn't seen anything." Keller set down his pen. "Mr. Aldous, what you're describing is a plan to commit murder. I need you to understand that. If you swear to this in a courtroom, it will change everything for every person involved in this case." "I know it," Pete said. He looked at Emmy for the first time since he had started speaking. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I was scared. I'm still scared. But when I saw that little girl ride up to the ranch today with the sheriff, and I saw that bruise on her face, I knew I couldn't keep my mouth shut anymore. If nobody stops Darius Cole, he's going to keep hurting people until there's nobody left to hurt." Emmy looked back at him. Her eyes were dry, but there was something in them that had not been there before. A recognition, perhaps, that she was not alone in having seen the truth about her uncle. "Thank you," she said. Just that. 2 words, quiet and clear. Pete nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, but the words didn't come. Keller finished writing and set the statement in front of Pete with a pen. "Read it through and sign at the bottom if it's accurate." Pete read it. His hand shook slightly as he signed. Keller took the paper and blotted it, then folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. "You'll need to stay in town for now. I can't have you going back to the ranch where Darius's men can reach you." "I was hoping you'd say that," Pete said. "The livery said they could use an extra hand. I'll sleep in the hayloft if I have to." "That can be arranged," Keller said. He looked at Caleb. "This changes things. Pete's testimony, combined with the medical report and the will, gives us enough to hold Darius on suspicion while we wait for the circuit judge. I'm going to send that wire to Laramie today. I want Judge Connell here before the week is out." "Will Darius fight the arrest?" Caleb asked. "He'll fight everything," Keller said. "That's what he does. But he can't fight a witness who saw the planning and the aftermath. Not with the evidence we've got." Caleb looked at Emmy. She had not moved from the bench. The tin box was still in her lap, but her hands had relaxed slightly, and her breathing had slowed. She was processing. That was what she did. She took in information, no matter how terrible, and she held it somewhere inside until she could make sense of it. "Emmy," he said, "we're going to go home now. We're going to eat something and rest, because tomorrow is going to be another long day." She stood up without arguing. That was how he knew how much she had left. Not much. When a child who has been fighting stops fighting long enough to agree to rest, it means the reserves are nearly gone. They rode back to Caleb's house in the afternoon heat. Nettie had gone ahead to her own place, saying she had chickens to tend and a letter to write to the circuit judge's mother, just in case the wire got lost. Pete had settled in at the livery with Ray Tibbs, who had been told enough to understand that the young man needed a place to stay and had not asked questions. The house was quiet when they walked in. The kitchen still smelled of the coffee Caleb had made before dawn. The settle where Emmy had slept the first night still had Clara's blue blanket folded at one end. The world had changed so much in 24 hours that the familiar objects in the room seemed almost foreign to him. Caleb built a fire in the stove and put water on for tea. He cut bread and set out the last of the butter and a jar of preserves that Clara had put up 3 summers ago. He had been saving it for a special occasion, and he could not think of a more appropriate moment than feeding a child who had just heard the details of her father's murder. Emmy sat at the table and ate mechanically, not tasting, but eating. He did not push her to talk. He let the silence stretch, and he ate his own bread, and he waited. After a while she said, "Do you think they'll find his body?" Caleb set down his bread. "Ward is sending men to the Cheyenne Road tomorrow. Pete can show them exactly where to look. What if they don't find anything? Then we have Pete's testimony, and we have the medical evidence of what Darius did to you, and we have the will. A jury can convict on that without a body. It's harder, but it's possible." "Harder," Emmy repeated. She looked down at the table. "Everything is harder when you don't have money or power." "That's true," Caleb said. "But it's also true that right now, Darius Cole is sitting in his house wondering how much Pete Aldis told us and how much the law can do with it. He's not sleeping well tonight. That's worth something. Do you think he's scared?" "I think he's worried. There's a difference. Worried is when you have something to lose and you're not sure you can hold on to it. Scared is when you know you've already lost it." He paused. "Darius isn't scared yet, but he will be." She looked at him with those old, clear eyes. "You sound like you know that for certain." "I know that men like Darius Cole spend their whole lives making sure nobody pushes back. They build their power on the assumption that people will back down, and when someone doesn't back down, they don't know what to do. They've never practiced losing. Are you going to back down?" He looked at her. "No." She nodded once and went back to eating her bread. The afternoon passed slowly. Caleb worked in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds that had sprung up in the night's warmth, checking the tomatoes that were finally beginning to ripen. He did it out of habit, but also because the physical labor helped him think. He turned over the conversation with Keller, the weight of Pete's testimony, the chess game that was unfolding with Darius Cole. Every move Darius had made so far had been calculated to buy time, to muddy the water, to make the legal path so complicated that the truth would get lost in the paperwork. That meant Darius was not planning to fight in court. He was planning to make the court irrelevant. The thought stopped Caleb with his hand on a tomato vine. He straightened and looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the mountains. If Darius could not win in a courtroom, he would find another way. The man had already shown that he was willing to kill to protect what he wanted. What was stopping him from trying again? Caleb went inside and cleaned his hands at the pump. He checked the Colt, made sure it was loaded, and put it back in his belt. He did not tell Emmy why he was doing it, but she saw. She always saw. Supper was simple: beans and salt pork and the last of the cornbread. They ate on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to orange to the deep blue of evening. The heat of the day had finally broken, and there was a coolness in the air that felt like a promise of autumn, though August was not yet half over. "Caleb," Emmy said, "what happens if the judge rules against us?" He had been expecting the question. He had been asking it himself, turning it over in his mind, trying to find an answer that did not end in disaster. "Then we appeal," he said. "We take it to a higher court. We use Pete's testimony and the medical report and the will, and we keep fighting until we run out of courts or we win." "And if we run out of courts?" He looked at her. "Then we figure out something else." She seemed to accept that. She leaned back against the porch post and looked up at the stars that were beginning to emerge, one by one, in the darkening sky. "Papa used to tell me stories about the mustangs," she said. "He said they were descended from the horses the Spanish brought 300 years ago. They've been running free on this range longer than any of us have been alive. He said that when he looked at them, he remembered that some things can't be broken, no matter how hard you try." "He was right," Caleb said. "I don't want to be broken," she said. It was the first time she had said anything that sounded like a fear, spoken aloud, without the armor of practicality. "You won't be," he said. "You've already survived the worst thing that could happen to you. Everything after this is building." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Is that what you did? After Clara and Rose died?" The question hit him in a place he had not expected. He had to take a breath before he answered. "I survived," he said. "I didn't build, not for a long time. I just survived, day after day, until surviving became a habit. It took 7 years and a girl with bleeding feet on my porch to remind me that there's a difference between being alive and living." "Are you living now?" He thought about it. "I'm starting to." She nodded, and they sat in silence as the stars filled the sky and the night sounds of the prairie rose around them, crickets, and the distant call of a night bird, and somewhere far off, the faint, lonely sound of a horse. The ride from town came just before midnight. Caleb heard the hoofbeats while he was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and the will spread out in front of him. He had been reading it again, looking for something he might have missed, some clause or provision that could strengthen their case. The hoofbeats stopped in the yard, and he heard a voice he recognized, one of Keller's deputies, a young man named Ben Tilley, who had been on the force less than a year. "Caleb, you awake?" Caleb opened the door. Ben was still in the saddle, his horse blowing hard. He had ridden fast. "What is it?" "Keller sent me." Ben's voice was tight. "Darius Cole filed a competing claim at the land office tonight. Harold Fitch came to the sheriff's office an hour ago with the papers. Says Darius brought them in just before closing, and Fitch couldn't refuse them. They were properly notarized and filed in the correct format." It's a claim based on the estate settlement, arguing that the will is invalid because Samuel failed to contest the settlement within the legal window. Caleb felt the cold stone return to his gut. "What does Keller say?" "He says the claim doesn't change the law, but it changes the timeline. With a competing claim on file, the circuit judge will have to review both documents before making a ruling. That could take weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, the property is in legal limbo. Darius can't be removed, but neither can he sell or transfer anything without a court order." "And the mustangs?" Caleb asked. Ben hesitated. "The mustangs are part of the property. They can't be moved or sold either, but there's nothing in the law that says Darius can't handle them in the meantime. He could break them, he could mark them, He could do whatever he wants with them as long as he claims he's maintaining the property. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had known Darius would find an angle. He had not expected it to come this fast. "Tell Keller I'll be in town at first light," he said. Ben nodded and turned his horse. The hoofbeats faded into the night. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking out at the dark. He heard Emmy's voice from inside, quiet and already knowing. "What happened?" He turned. She was standing at the entrance to the front room, wrapped in Clara's blue blanket. She had been asleep, but she had woken, perhaps at the sound of the horse, perhaps at something deeper. "Darius filed a competing claim," he said. "It doesn't change the truth, but it slows everything down." She absorbed that. Then she said, "What do we do?" "We go to town tomorrow and we talk to Keller. We find out how long we're looking at and what our options are." "And the mustangs?" He heard something in her voice, not fear, but urgency. She understood the stakes as well as he did. "We protect them," he said, "one way or another." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. She did not go back to sleep. She came to the kitchen table and sat down across from him, and they stayed there together in the lamplight, silent and watchful, as the night deepened around them and the first cold wind of autumn whispered through the cracks in the walls. At 2 in the morning, another rider came. This time the hoofbeats were slower, more hesitant. Caleb was at the door before the horse stopped moving. He saw a figure dismount, a woman, small and wrapped in a shawl, moving with the careful steps of someone who had not been on a horse in a long time. It was Nettie Hargrove. She walked up to the porch without greeting, her face pale in the moonlight. She looked at Caleb, then at Emmy, who had come to stand behind him. "I got a letter tonight," Nettie said, "from Ezra Cannell's mother. She says the circuit judge has been delayed. There was a railway accident north of Laramie that's holding up all travel. He won't be able to get to Harlan County for at least 3 weeks, maybe longer." The words landed like stones. Caleb did not move. "3 weeks," Emmy said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "At least," Nettie said, "and there's more. The letter says that Darius has a contact in the Laramie court, a clerk who owes him favors. She doesn't know what the favor is, but she's heard that the clerk has been asking questions about the case, trying to find out if there's any way to get it dismissed before the judge even sees it." Caleb felt the cold stone spread. It was not fear. It was the recognition that Darius Cole had more layers than he had anticipated, more connections, more angles. They had thrown their best punches, and the man was still standing, still moving, still making moves. "Thank you, Nettie," Caleb said, "for riding out here in the middle of the night to tell us. I wasn't going to let you face this in the morning without knowing what you're up against," Nettie said. She looked at Emmy. "Child, you've got more people on your side than Darius knows about. Don't forget that." Emmy stepped forward and hugged Nettie. It was quick and fierce, the kind of hug a child gives when words are not enough. Nettie held her for a moment, then released her and turned back to her horse. "I'll be at the courthouse at dawn," she said. "We're not done yet." She rode off into the dark. Caleb and Emmy stood on the porch in the silence, watching the road where she had disappeared. The stars were starting to fade. Morning was not far off. 3 weeks, Emmy said again. 3 weeks, Caleb agreed. "That's time for a lot of things to happen." "What kind of things?" He looked down at her. Her face was ghostly in the moonlight, but her eyes were steady. "The kind that depend on what we do with it," he said. "We're not waiting. We're not sitting here while Darius figures out his next move. Tomorrow, you and I are going to ride to that ranch, and we're going to start moving the mustangs to the west pasture, onto the land that the will says is yours. And we're going to do it in broad daylight, with witnesses, so that every person in Harlan County knows whose side the truth is on. He'll try to stop us. Let him try." Caleb turned and went inside to get his coat. "We've got 3 weeks until the judge comes. That's 3 weeks to make sure that when he does arrive, the evidence is so clear and so public that Darius Cole can't talk his way out of it." Emmy followed him inside. She did not ask if he was sure. She did not ask if it was safe. She simply went to the corner where she had left her things and began to dress for the ride. Outside, the first gray hint of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky. And somewhere in the dark, on the road between Caleb's house and the Cole ranch, a horse was moving fast. carrying a message that would change everything before the sun had fully risen. The first gray light of dawn found Caleb Dawson and Emmy Cole already on the road, riding east toward the Cole ranch with the morning chill biting through their coats. The sky was the color of old pewter, streaked with orange where the sun would eventually break through, and the prairie stretched out around them in a landscape of muted browns and greens, still and waiting. Bess moved at a steady pace, her breath pluming in the cool air, and Emmy sat behind Caleb with her arms wrapped around his waist and the tin box tucked safely between them. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the house. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said in the dark hours before dawn, when they had sat at the kitchen table and planned what they could plan and accepted what they could not. The plan was simple in its structure and dangerous in its execution. They would ride to the Cole ranch, not to the main house, but to the western range where the Mustang herd grazed. They would begin moving the horses across the boundary line onto the land that the will designated as Emmy's, land that Samuel Cole had fought to keep and that the law still recognized as belonging to his heirs. They would do it in plain sight, with witnesses, so that every hired hand and every neighbor who saw them would know that the claim was being made openly and without fear. If Darius wanted to stop them, he would have to do it in front of witnesses, and that would be a different kind of evidence than paperwork filed in the dark of night. Caleb had not told Emmy the full extent of his concern. He had not told her that he expected Darius to respond, and that the response might not be legal. He had not told her that he was carrying the Colt loaded and ready, and that he had made peace with using it if necessary. She was 10 years old. She had already seen more violence than most people saw in a lifetime. He would not add the weight of his own preparations to her load unless he had to. They reached the boundary line of the Cole property as the sun cleared the horizon. The fence was old barbed wire, sagging in places, held together by the kind of neglect that comes when the owner is more interested in lawsuits than in ranching. Beyond it, the western range rolled out in a shallow basin of grass and sage, and there, scattered across the slope like living shadows, were the mustangs. Caleb stopped Bess at the fence line and sat for a moment, watching them. There were maybe 30 of them, maybe more. It was hard to count from a distance because they moved constantly, shifting and flowing like a single organism. They were not large horses by the standards of the eastern breeds, but they were compact and hardy, with deep chests and strong legs, and the kind of alert intelligence that comes from generations of surviving without human help. The lead mare was a dark bay with a white blaze on her face, and she raised her head as she caught sight of the horse and riders at the fence line, watching them with the calm assessment of an animal that had decided long ago that humans were not to be trusted, but could be managed. "That's her," Emmy said quietly. "That's the lead mare. Papa called her Rain. He said she'd been running this range since before he was born, and that she'd probably still be running it long after he was gone." Caleb looked at the mare. She was beautiful in the way that wild things are beautiful, not because of any symmetry or refinement, but because of the force of life in her, the sheer stubborn determination to exist on her own terms. "Your papa was right," he said. "Let's get them moving." He dismounted and opened the gate. The wire sagged and caught on the post, and he had to lift it clear with his shoulder. It was the kind of maintenance that a working ranch would have done weeks ago, and the neglect told him that Darius had not been running this place as a ranch at all. He had been running it as a prize, an asset to be captured and then bled dry. Emmy slid down from Bess and stood beside him, looking at the mustangs with a mixture of longing and sorrow. "They don't know what's happening," she said. "They don't know that Papa is gone or that everything is about to change. They just keep running the same range they've always run, doing what they've always done." "That's what makes them strong," Caleb said. "They don't wait for permission to live, they just live." He walked forward slowly, not toward the herd but parallel to it, letting them see him and adjust to his presence. He had worked with horses his whole life, though mostly with draft animals and the occasional saddle horse. Wild mustangs were a different matter. They had never been haltered or shod or asked to carry a rider. They did not understand the language of human hands. He would have to speak to them in the language of the range: patience, stillness, the slow building of trust. Emmy moved with him, keeping pace at his side. She did not try to approach the horses directly. She simply walked, letting them see her, letting them learn the shape of her and the sound of her footsteps. The lead mare watched them with her ears forward, tracking their movement, but not yet alarmed. They spent the first hour simply walking the boundary line, showing themselves to the herd, letting the horses grow accustomed to their presence. The mustangs drifted slowly away from them, not in panic, but in a measured withdrawal, maintaining a distance that felt safe. Caleb did not push. He had read somewhere that wild horses could be moved by patience, that if you simply walked the direction you wanted them to go, they would eventually follow the path of least resistance. He was about to test that theory. By the second hour, they had begun to turn the herd. It was subtle, a step here, a shift there. But the mustangs were beginning to move in a direction that led toward the boundary gate and the west pasture beyond it. Caleb kept his movements slow and his voice low, talking to the horses in the same calm tone he had used with Emmy the first night. "Easy now, that's it, just a little further." Emmy matched his rhythm. She did not speak, but she was attentive, watching the lead mare's ears and the subtle signals of the herd. She had learned from her father, Caleb realized. She had been watching him work these horses for years, and the knowledge was in her, even if she had never had a chance to use it on her own. They had moved the herd nearly half a mile when the riders appeared. Caleb saw them first, 3 men coming over the rise from the direction of the main house, moving fast. He recognized the leading horse immediately. It was the same big bay that had carried Briggs on the road the day before. Beside him rode Fowler, and behind them a third man that Caleb did not recognize. He stopped walking and put his hand out to stop Emmy. "Stay behind me," he said. "Caleb! Stay behind me and don't move unless I tell you." The riders came down the slope at a canter and pulled up 40 feet away, spreading out in a loose formation that blocked the path toward the gate. Briggs looked at the mustangs, then at Caleb, and something in his face tightened. "You've got no business on this land, Dawson. That herd belongs to Mr. Cole." "The herd belongs to Emmy Cole," Caleb said. "The will is on file at the county courthouse, and the guardianship is established. You can check with Sheriff Keller if you have questions about the legality." "I don't answer to the sheriff," Briggs said. "I answer to Mr. Cole, and Mr. Cole says nobody moves his property without his permission." "Then Mr. Cole can take it up with the circuit judge when he arrives in 3 weeks." Caleb did not raise his voice. He kept it steady and even, the same tone he had used with the horses. "Until then, the law says the property stays with the legal heir, and that's Emmy Cole. I'm moving these horses to the west pasture where they belong." Fowler shifted in his saddle. His hand rested on the stock of his rifle, not gripping it, but close. "You're making a mistake, Dawson." "I've made a lot of mistakes in my life," Caleb said. "This isn't one of them." The silence stretched. Briggs looked at Fowler, and something passed between them, a decision made without words. Caleb saw it, and his hand moved toward the colt at his hip, not drawing but ready. Then Emmy stepped out from behind him. She did not run. She did not shout. She simply walked forward until she was standing in front of Caleb, facing the 3 riders with her small frame and her bruised face and the tin box held against her chest like a shield. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "you held my arms while my uncle whipped me. I remember that. I remember every minute of it. And I remember that you didn't say a word. You just held and watched." Briggs's face went still. Whatever he had expected her to say, it was not that. "But I also remember," Emmy continued, "that when I used to see you in the barn, you always stopped to check on the horses. You made sure they had water, even when you weren't supposed to. You talked to them in a voice you never used with people. And I remember that once, when a foal was born too early, you stayed up all night with it until it was strong enough to stand." She paused. The wind moved through the grass around her ankles. "I don't think you're a bad man," she said. "I think you work for a bad man, and that's not the same thing. But right now, you have a choice. You can stand aside and let me take my father's horses to my father's land, or you can stop me and add another thing to the list of things you're going to have to answer for when the judge comes." The silence that followed was deeper than the one before it. Caleb watched Briggs's face, and he saw something move in it. Not a surrender, but a crack. A small one, barely visible, but it was there. Fowler looked at Briggs. "You're not listening to a child, are you?" Briggs did not answer. He looked at Emmy for a long moment. Then he looked at the mustangs, at the lead mare who had stopped moving and was watching the scene with her ears pricked forward, waiting. "The west pasture gate is locked," Briggs said finally. His voice was flat, but there was something in it that had not been there before. "Darius had it locked last night. The key is in the main house." Caleb understood immediately. It was not a surrender, it was a direction. Briggs was telling him where the obstacle was, which meant he was not going to create another one. "Then I'll find another way through," Caleb said. Briggs nodded once. He did not look at Fowler. He turned his horse and rode back toward the main house without another word. Fowler watched him go, then looked at Caleb with an expression that was hard and cold. "This isn't over." "No," Caleb agreed. "It isn't." Fowler rode after Briggs. The third man followed, and the three of them disappeared over the rise, leaving Caleb and Emmy alone in the basin with the mustangs and the morning light and the scent of sage. Emmy did not move until the riders were gone from sight. Then she turned to Caleb, and for the first time since she had stepped in front of him, her composure cracked. Her lower lip trembled, and she pressed her hand over her mouth to hold it still. "That was brave," Caleb said. "That was the bravest thing I've seen anyone do." "I was so scared," she whispered. "I thought he was going to shoot me." "So did I." He put his hand on her shoulder. "But you did it anyway. That's what matters." She leaned into him for a moment, just a brief press of her weight against his side, and then she straightened and looked at the mustangs. "We still need to get through the gate." "We'll find a way," Caleb said. "Promise." They spent the next hour walking the fence line, looking for a place where the wire could be cut and repaired without too much damage. Caleb found a section where the posts had rotted, and the wire was already hanging loose, and he used his knife and a length of rope from Bess's saddle to create a temporary gap. It was not elegant, but it would hold long enough to move the herd through. The mustangs were reluctant at first. The lead mare stopped at the gap and stood with her head high, sniffing the air, testing the unfamiliarity of the new ground on the other side. Emmy walked ahead of her, moving slowly, speaking in the same quiet voice her father had used. "Come on, Rain. It's all right. It's just grass and open sky. You've seen it before." The mare took a step, then another. Then she walked through the gap, and the rest of the herd followed her, flowing like water, finding its level, spreading out into the west pasture that Samuel Cole had fought to keep. Caleb stood at the gap and watched them go. The morning sun was fully up now, warm on his face, and the mustangs moved across the new grass with the same unhurried freedom they had always had. They did not know that the land had a different name now, or that a 10-year-old girl had just claimed it for them. Emmy came back through the gap and stood beside him, watching the herd settle into their new range. "We did it," she said. "We did part of it," Caleb said. "The hard part is still coming." "I know." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something he had not seen before. Not hope, exactly. It was too early for hope. But it was the beginning of hope, the small green shoot that pushes up through the ashes after a fire. "Let's go home," she said. They rode back to Caleb's house as the sun climbed toward noon. The herd was safe in the west pasture for now, but the weight of what they had done pressed on him. They had made their move. Now it was Darius's turn. The afternoon passed in a haze of small tasks. Caleb fixed a hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been loose for months. He sharpened his skinning knife. He checked the colt again, though he had checked it twice already. Emmy helped him in the garden, watering the tomatoes, pulling the last of the weeds. They did not talk about the morning. They did not talk about the riders, or the locked gate, or the look in Briggs's eyes. They worked, and the silence between them was not heavy but comfortable, the silence of two people who had learned to share the same space without needing to fill it with words. At dusk, Ben Tilley rode into the yard again. This time he was not alone. Behind him, on a horse that looked too big for his frame, was Pete Aldous. They dismounted together, and Ben wasted no time in delivering his news. "Caleb, there's been trouble at the land office. Harold Fitch is missing." Caleb set down the wood he had been carrying. "Missing how?" "He didn't come home last night. His wife went to the office this morning and found the door unlocked and the desk drawer open." The filing book was still there, but the copy of Darius's competing claim was gone. Gone, Caleb repeated. Stolen, Ben said, or taken. Either way, it's not there. And without the claim on file, there's nothing for the judge to rule on when he gets here. The only record of it is in Darius's hands. Caleb stood very still. The implications of this were spreading through his mind like ripples in a pond. Without the official filing, the legal path became muddier. Darius could claim the claim had never been properly submitted. He could argue that the will was still the only document on record, and then challenge it on other grounds. The loss of the filing was a loss of transparency, and transparency was the only weapon they had against a man like Darius Cole. "Where's Keller?" "On his way to the Cole Ranch," Ben said. "He took 2 deputies and a warrant to search the premises for the stolen filing. He wants you to stay here with Emmy until he gets back." "That's not going to happen," Caleb said. "Caleb, if Keller is riding into that ranch without me, he's riding into a trap. Darius didn't steal that filing just to hide it. He stole it because he's planning something that requires it to be out of public view." Pete spoke for the first time. "I know where Darius keeps his private papers. There's a safe in the back of his office, behind a false panel in the wall. I saw him open it once, when he thought everyone was out. If the filing is anywhere, it's there." Caleb looked at Pete, then at Ben, then at Emmy, who had come to stand in the doorway, listening. "How many men does Keller have?" "2 deputies plus himself," Ben said. "And he's going in with a warrant. That's legal procedure. He thinks Darius will comply." "Darius won't comply," Emmy said. Her voice was quiet but certain. "He never complies. Not unless he gets something out of it." Caleb made his decision. "Ben, ride back to Keller and tell him to wait at the boundary road. Tell him I'm coming, and that I'm bringing someone who knows where to look. He can serve his warrant with whatever force he needs, but he should not enter the house without knowing what's waiting for him." Ben hesitated. "You're not going to do anything reckless, are you?" "I'm going to do what's necessary," Caleb said. "That's all I ever do." Ben rode off into the gathering dark. Pete stayed, looking at Caleb with the expression of a man who had already signed on for something he did not fully understand. "You really think there's a trap?" "I know there is," Caleb said. "I just don't know what kind yet." He went inside to get his coat and the Colt. When he came out, Emmy was standing by Bess, holding the tin box. "You're not coming," Caleb said. "I'm the legal heir. If there's a confrontation, my presence changes things. It also puts you in danger." "I've been in danger all week," she said. "I'd rather be in it with you than waiting here alone, not knowing." He looked at her for a long moment. She was not going to be swayed. He could see that in the set of her jaw, in the way she held the tin box with both hands, in the steadiness of her gaze. "All right," he said. "Stay close to me and do exactly what I say." She nodded and climbed onto Bess without waiting for help. Pete mounted his horse, and the 3 of them rode into the twilight, toward the Cole Ranch, toward whatever Darius Cole had planned for them. The sky was dark by the time they reached the boundary road where Keller was waiting. He had his 2 deputies with him, both armed, both looking as tense as men who knew they were walking into something they could not fully anticipate. Keller's face was grim when he saw Caleb ride up. "I told Ben to tell you to stay at your place. I brought someone who knows where Darius keeps his papers," Caleb said, nodding at Pete. "You're going to need that if you want to find the filing before he moves it somewhere else." Keller looked at Pete, then at Emmy. "She shouldn't be here." "She wouldn't stay behind." Keller's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. He had seen enough of Emmy Cole to know that arguing with her was like arguing with the weather, pointless and exhausting. "We go in together," Keller said. "I serve the warrant. We search the house. We find the filing. If Darius resists, we arrest him for obstruction. Everyone clear?" The deputies nodded. Caleb checked the Colt one last time and settled it in his belt. They rode the last mile to the ranch house in silence. The house was lit, lamps in the front windows, smoke rising from the chimney, and as they approached, the front door opened, and Darius Cole stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing the same composed, pleasant expression he had worn the day before, as if they were old friends arriving for a social call. "Ward," he called out, "to what do I owe the pleasure of a second visit in 2 days?" Keller dismounted and held up the warrant. I have a warrant to search these premises for stolen property. A filing was taken from the land office last night, and I have reason to believe it's here. Darius's expression did not change. I've heard about that. Terrible business. But I assure you I have no idea what happened to that filing. It's not in my house. Then you won't mind if we take a look? Darius spread his hands. Be my guest. He stepped aside with a grace that was too smooth, too accommodating. Caleb felt the cold stone tighten in his gut. Darius was not worried. That was the problem. He was standing on his porch, welcoming a search, like a man who knew exactly what the searchers would find. Keller led the way inside. The deputies fanned out through the front room, opening cabinets and drawers, checking the fireplace mantel. Pete slipped through the kitchen and into the back hallway, with Caleb and Emmy close behind him. The false panel was exactly where Pete had said it would be. In the small office at the back of the house, behind a set of shelves that looked like they had been there for decades, a section of the wall moved when Pete pressed on the corner. Behind it was a small safe, bolted to the floor with a combination lock. We need the combination, Pete said. We need a warrant that covers safes, Keller said, appearing in the doorway. He looked at the safe, then at the shelves. Unless one of you knows the combination, Emmy stepped forward. I do. Everyone turned to look at her. Uncle Darius used the same combination for everything, she said. It was his mother's birthday. He told my father once that he never changed it because he was too lazy to remember a new one. She knelt in front of the safe and spun the dial. Once, twice, 3 times. There was a click, and the handle turned in her hand. The door swung open. Inside was a stack of papers tied with string, a leather money pouch, and a small velvet pouch that clinked when Emmy moved it. On top of the stack was a folded document with the seal of the Laramie Land Office. Keller reached past Emmy and picked it up. He opened it, read the first line, and his face went hard. It's the filing, the original, with Harold Fitch's signature. Caleb felt a surge of relief so sharp it almost hurt. The evidence was there, in the sheriff's hands. They had caught Darius in a lie. But Darius was still standing on the porch with that pleasant, unruffled expression. And as they walked out of the office with the paper in Keller's hand, they found him waiting for them. Well, Darius said, his voice perfectly calm. I see you found what you were looking for. I have no idea how it got there. Someone must have planted it. We'll let the judge sort that out, Keller said. In the meantime, this filing is going into evidence, and you're coming with me for questioning. Darius smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew something the rest of them did not. Ward, I don't think you'll be taking me anywhere tonight. He raised his hand, and from the darkness beyond the porch, a dozen men stepped into the lantern light. They were not the hired hands from the bunkhouse. These were different, harder faces, better armed, the kind of men who did not work for wages but for promises. Behind Caleb, he heard Keller's breath catch. Darius Cole had called in his reserves, and the trap had just snapped shut. The lantern light from the porch spilled across the yard and caught the faces of the men who had materialized from the darkness. There were 12 of them, maybe 13. Hard men with hard eyes, carrying rifles and shotguns, and the kind of patience that comes from being paid to wait. They did not spread out in a formation. They simply stood, filling the space between the porch and the fence line, blocking any path to the horses. The night air, which had been cool and still, suddenly felt thick and close, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Caleb's hand moved to the Colt, but he did not draw it. 13 armed men against a sheriff, 2 deputies, a carpenter, a young ranch hand, and a 10-year-old girl were not odds that a gun could fix. He kept his hand on the grip, though. Let the weight of it remind him that he was not unarmed and not helpless. Sometimes the line between a bluff and a stand was measured in inches, and the steadiness of a man's voice. "Mr. Cole?" Keller said. His voice was steady, but Caleb could hear the effort behind it. The sheriff was calculating the same odds and reaching the same conclusion. "I am an officer of the law, serving a lawful warrant. Interfering with that is a felony." "I'm not interfering." Darius still wore that pleasant, unhurried smile. He had not moved from the porch. "I'm simply ensuring that my property is protected while you conduct your search. These men are here to observe, nothing more. If you're doing your duty lawfully, you have nothing to fear from them. Tell them to stand down." "They're not in your way, Ward. They're just standing there. It's a free country." Keller's jaw tightened. He looked at the men, then back at Darius, and Caleb could see the calculation running behind his eyes. The sheriff had a warrant. He had the stolen filing in his hand, and he had the legal authority to arrest Darius Cole on the spot. But he also had a 12-year-old girl standing 3 feet behind him, and 12 armed men between him and the road. The law was clear. The situation was not. "We're leaving," Keller said. "We have what we came for. If you want to contest the evidence, you can do it in front of a judge." "I intend to." Darius stepped off the porch, moving with that same fluid ease that made him look like a man who had never been genuinely threatened in his life. "But I'm afraid I can't let you leave just yet." He snapped his fingers, and 2 of the armed men moved to block the path to the horses. The deputies tensed, their hands going to their weapons, but Keller put out his arm to stop them. "What are you doing, Darius?" "I'm protecting my interests." Darius walked past Keller and stopped in front of Caleb. He looked at Emmy, who was standing just behind Caleb's left shoulder, and his smile did not change, but his eyes did. They went cold and flat, the way a snake's eyes go before it strikes. "You've been busy, Dawson. I'll give you credit. Most men would have folded by now." "I'm not most men," Caleb said. "No, you're not." Darius studied him for a moment. "You're a carpenter who decided to pick up a gun and a child and a legal case that was none of your business. You've cost me time and money and the loyalty of at least one hand who decided to talk to the sheriff instead of keeping his mouth shut. That takes a certain kind of stubbornness. It takes a certain kind of knowing right from wrong." Darius laughed. It was a dry sound, without humor. Right from wrong. You think that matters? You think the judge is going to care about right and wrong when he looks at the paperwork? He's going to care about which document was filed first, which signature was witnessed properly, which claim has the stronger legal foundation. That's how the law works, Dawson. It's not about justice, it's about procedure. Then I'm glad we have the procedure on our side. Darius's smile thinned. He looked at the document in Keller's hand. "You found that in my safe. But you also found a stack of other papers in there, didn't you? Papers that establish a different chain of ownership. Papers that predate Samuel's will by 6 months. Keller's face went still. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that my mother signed a separate deed of trust 18 months before she died, transferring the Western Range to me directly. Samuel didn't know about it. I kept it quiet because I didn't want to tip my hand before the time was right." Darius's voice was smooth and deliberate, like a man laying down cards one at a time. "That deed is in the safe. You saw it. You just didn't read it." Keller looked down at the stack of papers in his other hand. He had picked up the whole bundle when he took the filing. Now he flipped through it, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty. "This deed is notarized," he said slowly. "It is. The signature matches your mother's." "It does." Keller looked up at Darius, and in that look was the dawning realization that they had been outmaneuvered. The stolen filing was a trap within a trap. Darius had let them find it, let them think they had won, while the real weapon was sitting there in the same stack, disguised as irrelevant paperwork. "This changes things," Keller said. "It changes everything," Darius said, "because that deed predates Samuel's will, which means the will is invalid. The Western Range was never Samuel's to leave to his daughter. It was mine all along." Emmy had not moved, but Caleb felt her go rigid beside him. He put his hand on her shoulder, a warning to stay still, to stay quiet, to let the adults talk even though everything in her was probably screaming to fight back. "That deed won't hold up in court," Caleb said. "If it exists, why didn't you produce it before? Why let the dispute drag on for 2 years?" "Because I didn't need to." Darius's voice was mild, almost bored. "I was patient. I knew Samuel would eventually make a mistake, and when he did, I would have everything I needed, and I was right. His mistake was going to Cheyenne. His mistake was leaving his daughter behind." He looked at Emmy, and the coldness in his eyes deepened. "His mistake was trusting a stranger with her life instead of facing me like a man." Emmy's voice cut through the night like a blade. "My father was braver than you will ever be." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the armed men seemed to hold their breath. Darius looked at her, and for the first time something real flickered behind his composed mask. It was not anger. It was something colder. It was the recognition that this child, this 10-year-old girl, was not afraid of him. And that was a kind of power he did not know how to counter. "We're taking that deed into evidence," Keller said, "along with the filing. Both documents will go before the judge." "You're not taking anything anywhere." Darius's voice had lost its pleasant edge. He was done pretending. "You're going to hand me that stack of papers, and you're going to walk out of here with nothing. And you're going to tell Judge Connell that the filing was never found, and that the deed was a misunderstanding, and that you have no basis to hold me." "That's not going to happen." "It is going to happen, because if it doesn't, I'm going to tell those 12 men to start shooting." Darius's voice was flat and final. "I'll kill every one of you. I'll kill the sheriff in his own county and blame it on outlaws. I'll kill the girl and burn the will and bury the whole mess so deep nobody will ever find it. And I'll walk away clean because I have the money to buy my way out of any investigation." The threat hung in the air, solid as stone. Caleb looked at the armed men. They were watching Darius, waiting for a signal. They were not here to observe. They were here to execute. "You can't kill a sheriff and walk away," Keller said. "I can kill a sheriff and pay the governor's cousin to look the other way. Don't tell me what I can't do, Ward. I've been doing it for 20 years. Caleb looked at Emmy. She was staring at Darius with an expression he had not seen on her before. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something cold and determined. The look of a person who had reached the end of what she could endure and was ready to fight back with whatever she had left. He knew that look because he had seen it in his own mirror the night Clara died, when he had stood in the empty bedroom and understood that grief would either break him or sharpen him. He had chosen to let it break him. He had spent 7 years in that broken place, and it had taken a child with bleeding feet to pull him out of it. He would not let her be broken. Not by Darius Cole, not by anyone. "Make your choice, Dawson," Darius said. "You can live and forget this ever happened, or you can die and leave Emmy alone in the world. I'll give you 10 seconds. Caleb did not move. He did not reach for the Colt. He did not look at Keller or the deputies or the armed men. He looked at Emmy, and he spoke to her in a voice so quiet that only she could hear. "When I tell you, you run. You run to the barn and you don't stop. You know the way." "Caleb!" "Do not argue with me, not now." She closed her mouth. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. 10 seconds, Darius said. Caleb looked up at the sky. It was clear and full of stars. Somewhere out in the west pasture, the mustangs were running, wild and free, doing what they had always done. He had made a choice that morning, on the porch of his house, when he had loaded the Colt and put it in his belt. It was the same choice he had made the first time he had opened the screen door and caught Emmy in his arms. He was not going to let her go. "I'll take the third option," Caleb said. He drew the Colt and fired. The shot was not aimed at Darius. It was aimed at the lantern on the porch. The glass shattered, the flame caught the spilled oil, and in a heartbeat the porch was ablaze, a wall of fire rising between them and the armed men. In the chaos of shouting and horses rearing, Caleb grabbed Emmy by the arm and ran. He pulled her off the porch and into the dark, heading not for the horses, but for the barn, for the back door that Pete had used, for the window that did not latch. He heard Keller shouting behind him, heard the deputies return fire, heard the sound of men scattering in the confusion. He did not look back. The barn was dark and silent. The horses inside were shifting nervously at the sound of the gunfire, but they had not yet panicked. Caleb pulled Emmy toward the back wall, toward the window that had been their way in 2 nights ago. "You remember how to get to the west pasture from here?" "Yes." "Then go. Don't stop. Don't look back. Find the mustangs and stay with them until I come for you." "What about you?" "I'll find you." She looked at him. Her face was streaked with tears and smoke, but her eyes were steady. "You promise?" "I promise." He pushed her toward the window. She climbed through without another word, dropping into the darkness on the other side. He watched her disappear into the night, small and swift, and brave beyond all reason. Then he turned and went back into the fight. The fire was spreading. The porch was fully ablaze now, and the flames were catching the dry wood of the house. Men were shouting, horses were screaming, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Darius Cole was shouting orders that nobody was listening to because every man in the yard was too busy trying to save himself from the fire. Caleb found Keller behind the water trough, firing toward the fence line where two of the armed men had taken cover. The sheriff's face was black with smoke, but his eyes were sharp. "Where's Emmy?" "Gone. West pasture." "Good. Cover me. I need to get to the horses." Caleb fired twice toward the fence line, not aiming to hit, just to keep heads down. Keller ran for the horses, his long legs eating up the ground. The deputies were still on the porch, beating at the flames with their coats, trying to keep the fire from reaching the main structure. A shape moved in the darkness to Caleb's left. He turned, raising the Colt, and recognized Pete Aldous, crouched low and moving fast. "Darius is in the house," Pete said. "He went back in when the fire started. He's going for the safe." "Then we're going after him." They went through the kitchen door, which was already hot to the touch. The fire had not reached this part of the house yet, but the smoke was thick, and the air was hard to breathe. Caleb pulled his bandana up over his mouth and nose and pushed forward. The office was at the end of the hallway. The door was open, and through the smoke, Caleb could see Darius Cole standing in front of the open safe, stuffing papers into a leather satchel. He looked up when they entered, and for the first time, Caleb saw genuine fury in his face. "You've destroyed everything," Darius said. "Do you understand that? Everything I built, everything I worked for. You and that child and your righteous stupidity." "I understand that you're going to prison," Caleb said. Darius laughed. It was a ragged, desperate sound. "Prison? You think a fire and a few bullet holes are going to put me in prison? I have more money than you can imagine. I have lawyers who will tear your testimony apart. I have—" He stopped. His eyes went to the window, where the orange glow of the fire was reflected in the glass. "The mustangs," he said. "The herd. I'll have them shot. Every last one of them. I'll leave their bones to bleach on the range, and there won't be a single horse left for that girl to claim." Caleb moved before he knew he was moving. He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed Darius by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "You will not touch those horses." Darius smiled. It was the smile of a man who had nothing left to lose and had decided to enjoy the destruction. "I already sent word. The men on the north fence have orders to start shooting at dawn if I don't call them off. And I'm not going to call them off." Caleb's grip tightened. The fire crackled somewhere behind them, and the walls groaned with the heat. "Where's the word?" "Gone. Already gone. They'll be waiting with rifles when the sun comes up." Pete pulled at Caleb's arm. "We have to go. The roof is going to go." Caleb released Darius. He took the satchel full of papers from the desk, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out of the office without looking back. Darius shouted something after them, but the words were lost in the roar of the collapsing porch. They made it out through the kitchen door as the roof of the main house groaned and fell in a shower of sparks and embers. The yard was chaos. The fire had spread to the bunkhouse, and men were running in all directions, carrying buckets, beating at flames, trying to save what they could. Keller was already mounted, holding the reins of Bess. Caleb swung into the saddle, and Pete climbed onto a horse that one of the deputies had freed from the burning stable. "Emmy!" Keller shouted. "West pasture. I told her to stay with the mustangs." "Then that's where we're going." They rode hard, leaving the burning ranch behind them. The fire lit up the sky, casting long shadows across the prairie. Caleb kept Bess at a gallop, following the fence line, looking for the gap they had made that morning. The sun was still below the horizon, but the sky to the east was beginning to lighten. Dawn was coming, and with it, the men with rifles. They found Emmy where he had left her, at the edge of the west pasture, sitting on a flat rock with Rain standing 20 feet away, watching her with ears pricked forward. She stood when she saw them coming, and her face was a mixture of relief and fear. "The fire," she said. "I saw it from here." "Darius is done," Caleb said, dismounting. "His house is burned, the evidence is safe, but we have a problem." He knelt in front of her and took her shoulders. "He sent word to his men on the north fence. They're going to start shooting the mustangs at dawn." Emmy's face went white. "When is dawn?" Caleb looked at the sky. The first color was starting to show. "About 30 minutes." Without a word, Emmy turned and ran toward the herd. Caleb grabbed her arm before she could get far. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to move them. The East Canyon, there's a draw that leads to a box canyon. It's hidden from the north fence. If I can get them there, they'll be safe. You can't move an entire herd by yourself." "I can try." He looked at her face. She was not playing. She was not hoping. She was going to try, with everything she had, because that was what her father had taught her to do. "Then I'm coming with you." They moved into the herd as the first light of dawn touched the tops of the sagebrush. The mustangs were restless, sensing the change in the air, the smoke from the fire, the tension in the humans who walked among them. Rain stood at the center of the herd, her head high, her nostrils flared, waiting. Emmy walked up to her slowly, her hand extended, her voice low and steady. "Come on, Rain. We have to go. There are men coming with guns, and we have to be somewhere else." The mare watched her. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Rain took a step forward and lowered her head and let Emmy touch her muzzle. Caleb held his breath. He had seen a lot of things in his life, but he had never seen a wild mustang let a child touch her like that. "She knows me," Emmy said. "She's known me since I was little. Papa used to bring me out here, and we'd sit on that ridge, and he'd tell me their names and their stories. And Rain would always be watching." She turned and began to walk east toward the canyon, and Rain followed her. One by one, the rest of the herd began to move, following their lead mare, following the girl who walked ahead of them into the growing light. Caleb watched them go, a carpenter from a small house with a garden full of tomatoes and a heart full of grief, following a herd of wild horses and a 10-year-old girl into the unknown. Behind him, the fire still burned. Ahead of him, the sun was rising. He mounted Bess and rode after them, and the sound of hoofbeats on the prairie was the only music he needed. The mustangs moved like a living river through the gray light of early dawn, flowing around Emmy as she walked ahead of them with her hand still extended toward Rain's muzzle. The lead mare matched her pace step for step, and behind them the herd followed in a loose, flowing column that stretched back across the prairie like a dark ribbon unspooling across the sage. Caleb rode Bess at the rear, keeping a watch on the horizon behind them, where the smoke from the burning ranch house still rose in a thick column against the pale sky. The fire had spread faster than he had expected, and by now the main house was likely nothing but ash and ember. That meant Darius Cole was either dead or out in the open, and Caleb did not believe for a moment that a man like Darius Cole would let himself burn in his own house. The East Canyon was 3 miles from the west pasture, a narrow draw that cut through the bluffs and opened into a box canyon that Samuel Cole had used as a winter shelter for the mustangs in the worst weather. Emmy had mentioned it that first night in his kitchen, drawing the geography from memory with her finger on the table. The canyon had water from a spring that ran year-round, and grass that stayed green longer than the open range because the high walls held the moisture. It was the perfect place to hide a herd, but only if they reached it before the men on the north fence carried out their orders. Caleb pushed Bess to a trot and came up alongside Emmy. Her face was set in concentration, her eyes fixed on the path ahead, but he could see the fatigue in the way she held her shoulders. She had not slept more than a few hours in the past 2 days. She had walked miles on injured feet, faced down armed men, watched her uncle's house burn, and now she was leading a herd of wild horses across open country with the threat of rifle fire hanging over every step. "How much further?" he asked. "Another mile, maybe a little more. There's a cut between 2 ridges up ahead. The draw starts just past that stand of juniper." He looked where she pointed. The juniper was maybe half a mile ahead, a dark cluster against the brown and green of the prairie. Beyond it, the land rose into low bluffs that had been worn by wind and water into a maze of draws and ravines. It was good country for hiding, but it was also good country for ambushes. "We need to move faster," he said. "The herd can't move faster. They're already at a pace they'll hold. If I push them, they'll scatter." He knew she was right. Mustangs were not cavalry horses. They were not trained to run in formation or respond to commands. They moved at the speed of their own choosing, and the only reason they were moving at all was because Rain trusted Emmy enough to follow her. Pushing them would break that trust, and without trust, they would be nothing but scattered shadows on the plain. He looked back again. The smoke was still rising, but there was something else now, movement on the ridge to the north. He squinted against the growing light, and his hand went to the colt before his mind had fully registered what he was seeing. Riders. 5 of them, maybe 6, coming over the ridge at a canter. They were too far away to identify, but they were moving with purpose, and they were heading in the direction of the herd. "We've got company," he said. Emmy looked back and her face tightened. "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe less. They'll be in rifle range before we reach the draw." She did not panic. She did not speed up. She simply turned back to Rain and began to walk faster, her hand still touching the mare's muzzle. The herd responded, quickening their pace without breaking formation. They could sense the urgency, even if they did not understand its source. Caleb dropped back to where Keller and Pete were riding. The sheriff's face was grim, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "That's Briggs leading them," Keller said. "I recognize the horse. Darius must have gotten word to them before the fire. Or he's still alive and gave the order himself." Keller looked at the draw ahead, then at the riders, then at Caleb. "How fast can you get that herd into the canyon?" "Emmy says another mile to the draw, then however long it takes to get them through it. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. I can buy you 10 minutes. Keller pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard. "Pete, ride with Caleb. If those riders get past me, you're the last line." "Sheriff," Caleb started. "I'm not asking, Dawson. I'm telling you. Get those horses to safety. That's what matters right now." Keller turned his horse and rode north at a trot, his rifle held across his saddle with the barrel pointed at the ground. He did not look back. He was a big man on a big horse, and the morning light caught the star on his chest and made it flash like a signal. Caleb watched him go, and then he turned Bess and followed Emmy toward the juniper stand. The herd moved faster now, responding to the tension that filled the air like the charge before a thunderstorm. The foals stayed close to their mothers, and the stallions at the edges of the group kept their heads up, ears swiveling, tracking the danger they could sense but not see. Rain stayed at Emmy's side, her pace steady and sure, and the rest of the herd followed her with the unthinking loyalty of creatures who had learned that survival depended on staying together. The juniper stand loomed ahead, and beyond it Caleb could see the opening of the draw, a narrow slash in the bluffs that widened as it went deeper. There was water in there, he could smell it, the cool dampness of a spring-fed creek cutting through the dry air. "Almost there," Emmy said. Her voice was strained, but she did not stop walking. The first shot came from behind them. It was a single rifle crack, distant and flat, and it echoed across the prairie like a stone skipping across still water. Caleb spun in the saddle, his heart pounding, but the shot had not come from the direction of Keller and the riders. It had come from the north ridge, closer to the herd, from a position he had not seen. A second shot, closer still. He saw the puff of dust where the bullet struck the ground 50 yards to the left of the herd. They were being bracketed, the shooters trying to turn the herd, to drive them away from the draw and back into the open. Emmy did not stop. She kept walking, and Rain kept following, and the herd kept moving behind them. The third shot kicked up dirt 20 yards ahead, and Caleb saw one of the younger horses break from the group and bolt to the side, taking 3 others with it. "Hold them!" he shouted. "Emmy, hold them steady!" She did not answer. She was focused on Rain, her hand still on the mare's muzzle, her voice a low and steady stream of words that Caleb could not hear, but could feel in the way the herd held its line. The shooters were on the ridge now, 2 men dismounted, their rifles trained on the herd. Caleb recognized the taller one as Fowler. The other was a man he did not know. They were 150 yards away, too far for a pistol shot, but close enough that he could see the set of Fowler's shoulders and the way he was sighting down the barrel. Fowler fired again. The bullet passed so close to Caleb's head that he felt the wind of it against his ear. He did not flinch. He drew the Colt and fired back, not aiming to hit, just to make Fowler think twice about his next shot. The bullet kicked up dust 10 feet from Fowler's position, and the shooter ducked instinctively, buying them a few seconds. "Get them into the draw!" Caleb shouted. Emmy was already moving. She had reached the mouth of the draw, and Rain was following her into the narrow passage, the herd pressing close behind them. The walls of the draw rose up on either side, blocking the view from the ridge, providing cover from the rifles. Caleb stayed at the entrance, keeping Bess between the herd and the shooters. He fired again, and again, emptying the Colt into the general direction of the ridge, not caring about accuracy, just caring about noise and fear and the illusion of resistance. Fowler's rifle cracked one more time, and Caleb felt a sharp burn across his left arm, high near the shoulder. It was not deep, but it was enough to make him drop the Colt's empty cylinder and fumble for fresh ammunition from his belt. Then Pete was beside him, his own rifle raised, firing 2 quick shots toward the ridge. The shots were well placed, close enough to Fowler's position that the man ducked again and did not rise. "Go," Pete said. "I'll hold them here. There are 2 of them and 1 of you. And I'm a better shot than both of them combined. Go." Caleb did not argue. He shoved fresh rounds into the Colt and wheeled Bess into the draw, following the herd into the shadow of the bluffs. The draw wound deeper into the earth, the walls rising higher on each side until they were 50 feet above him, sheer and gray and streaked with the dark stains of seeping water. The spring that fed the canyon was somewhere ahead, and he could hear the sound of it now, a soft trickle that grew louder as he rode forward. The herd had stopped. They were gathered in a wide basin at the end of the draw, where the walls opened out into a natural amphitheater of grass and rock, and a clear pool of water fed by a spring that cascaded down the far wall in a thin silver ribbon. The mustangs were drinking, their flanks heaving, their heads low with exhaustion. Emmy was standing at the edge of the pool, her hand resting on Rain's neck. She was shaking. He could see it from where he sat on Bess, the fine tremor that ran through her whole body now that the danger had passed and the adrenaline was draining away. He dismounted and walked to her, his arm still burning where the bullet had grazed it. He did not look at the wound. He did not want her to see it. "You did it," he said. She looked up at him. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, and her eyes were red, but there was something in them that he had not seen before. It was not relief. It was not triumph. It was the quiet, steady light of a person who had discovered that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. "We did it," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder, and they stood together in the canyon, watching the mustangs drink from the spring that Samuel Cole had shown his daughter on a long-ago afternoon when the world had made sense. The water was cold and clear. The walls of the canyon rose up around them like the hands of the earth itself, cradling them in a moment of perfect stillness. The sound of the rifle had stopped. Keller found them an hour later. He rode into the canyon with his coat torn and his hat missing, but he was whole, and behind him rode Pete Aldous, looking pale but alive. Keller dismounted stiffly and walked to the pool, where he knelt and splashed water on his face. "Fowler and his man pulled back when they saw your fire was coming," he said. "Briggs was already gone by the time I got there. Disappeared into the north pasture. The deputies are rounding up the rest of the men, but they're mostly hired hands who didn't sign on for murder. They're cooperating." "Darius?" Caleb asked. Keller shook his head. "Not found, not in the house, not anywhere on the property that my men have searched." The fire destroyed a lot of evidence, and it destroyed any clear sign of where he went. "He's alive," Emmy said. She had not moved from her spot by the pool. Her voice was flat and certain. "He's alive, and he's out there somewhere, and he's not done." Keller looked at her. "I've sent riders to every road out of Harlan County. If he's still in the area, we'll find him." "He's not in the area," Emmy said. "He's already gone. He had a plan for this. He always had a plan for everything. He knew the fire might come, and he knew what he would do if it did." Caleb watched her as she spoke, and he saw something in her that worried him. Not the certainty that was earned, hard-won from weeks and months of living in the shadow of her uncle's cruelty. It was the flatness in her voice, the way she stated the worst possible outcome as if it were simply a fact of weather, nothing to be surprised about. "Emmy," he said, "we have the will. We have the deed from Darius's safe, which may actually help us because it shows that he knew about the property transfer and concealed it from Samuel. We have Pete's testimony. We have Doc Crane's medical evidence. We have a lot, and Darius has nothing to lose," she said. "That makes him more dangerous than he was before." She was right. He knew she was right. A man with nothing to lose was capable of anything, and Darius Cole had lost everything in a single night. his house, his ranch, his legal claims, his hired men. The only thing he had left was his freedom, and he would use it to exact whatever revenge he could. Keller stood up and put his hat back on. "I'm going to send word to the circuit judge. The situation has changed, and I want him here as soon as the rail line is open. In the meantime, I'll have a deputy at the mouth of this canyon around the clock. Nobody gets to this herd without going through me." Emmy looked at him. "Thank you, Sheriff." Keller nodded. He did not say "you're welcome." He did not say it was his job. He just nodded, the way men do when they have seen something that has moved them beyond words. The rest of the morning passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The mustangs grazed along the canyon floor, and the foals found a patch of sunlight and lay down in it, exhausted from the run. Caleb sat on a flat rock near the spring and watched them, his arm now bandaged with a strip of his own shirt, while Emmy slept curled up against Rain's side. The lead mare stood guard over her, her ears moving constantly, tracking every sound in the canyon. Caleb thought about the road ahead. The circuit judge would come eventually, but even after the legal questions were settled, there would be the work of rebuilding, the challenge of running a ranch that had been neglected for years, the task of raising a child who had been damaged in ways that might never fully heal. He did not expect any of it to be easy. But as he watched Emmy sleep, her hand resting on Rain's flank, he realized that he had stopped expecting things to be easy a long time ago. What he expected now was simply to be present, to show up, to keep his word. And his word had been given to a dying man in a letter that was still folded in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The afternoon shadows were growing long when the rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Caleb saw him first, a lone figure on horseback silhouetted against the light. He reached for the colt, then stopped. The rider was not moving like a threat. He was sitting slumped in the saddle, his horse walking with the slow, tired gait of an animal that had been pushed too hard for too long. Caleb walked toward the rider, his hand still on the gun but his eyes watching carefully. As the horse came closer, he recognized the face under the dust and exhaustion. It was Ben Tilley, the young deputy who had come to his house the night before. Ben slid off his horse before it had fully stopped. His legs buckled under him, and Caleb caught him by the arm and lowered him to the ground. "Where's Keller?" Ben gasped. "At the ranch, I think. What happened?" Ben's face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "Darius Cole was seen on the Cheyenne Road an hour ago. He's heading east, but he didn't leave alone." "What do you mean?" "He took 3 of the ranch hands with him, and he took something else." Ben's voice dropped. "He took the notary records from the land office, the originals. All of them. Harold Fitch's wife found the office broken into this morning. The deed books, the filing records, everything that has his seal on it, they're all gone." Caleb felt the world tilt slightly. Without the notary records, the will itself could be called into question. Without the original filing documents, the entire chain of ownership for the Cole Ranch was open to dispute. Darius had not been running. He had been destroying the evidence. "He's heading to Cheyenne," Caleb said. "He's planning to get to the territorial court before the circuit judge can rule." "That's what Keller thinks," Ben said. "He's already getting a posse together. He sent me to tell you." The wind moved through the canyon, carrying the sound of the spring and the soft movements of the herd. Emmy was still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Caleb looked at the western sky, where the sun was beginning its long arc toward the mountains, and he thought about the road to Cheyenne, 150 miles of open prairie and badlands, and small towns where Darius Cole's money could still buy him a day's head start. "Ben," he said, "how long before Keller's posse is ready to ride?" "An hour, maybe 2. Tell him I'll be there." Ben nodded and climbed back onto his horse with visible effort. He rode out of the canyon, leaving Caleb alone with the herd and the sleeping girl and the weight of the choice he was about to make. He walked back to the spring and sat down next to Emmy. She stirred when he settled onto the rock beside her, and her eyes opened slowly. "What happened?" "Darius is heading for Cheyenne. He's taken the notary records. If he gets there before the circuit judge, he can have the entire case file destroyed or altered." She sat up, her face hardening into the expression he had come to recognize. "You're going after him." "I have to." "Then I'm coming with you." "No." She did not argue. She did not protest, She simply looked at him with those old, steady eyes and said, "Then you need to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that if you have to choose between catching him and staying alive, you'll stay alive. Because I've lost my father. I've lost my mother. I've lost my home and my herd and everything I thought I knew. I cannot lose you too." The words hit him low in the chest, hard and unexpected. He had not realized, until she said it, how much this child had come to mean to him. Not as a responsibility, not as a debt to a dead man, but as something that mattered for its own sake. "I promise," he said. She nodded and lay back down against Rain's flank and closed her eyes. Caleb stood and walked to Bess. He checked the colt, checked the cinch, and swung into the saddle. The sun was dropping toward the mountains, and the trail to Cheyenne was 150 miles long, and the only thing waiting for him at the end of it was a man with nothing left to lose. He touched the brim of his hat and looked back at Emmy one last time. Then he turned Bess toward the mouth of the canyon and rode out into the fading light. The ride back to town was a blur of dust and fading light. Caleb pushed Bess hard, and the mare responded with the loyalty of a horse that had carried him through a decade of hard miles. The sky above him was turning from orange to purple to the deep indigo of evening, and the first stars were already showing in the east. He did not look back at the canyon. He did not allow himself to think about Emmy sleeping against Rain's flank, because if he thought about it, he would turn around, and he could not turn around. The streets of Harlan County were quiet when he rode in. Most of the townspeople had gone inside for supper, but there was a knot of horses outside the sheriff's office, and a handful of men stood in the glow of the lanterns that had been lit along the boardwalk. Keller was among them, already mounted, his rifle in its scabbard, and his face set in the expression of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. "You made it," Keller said as Caleb dismounted. "I made it. Where are we?" "We've got a trail. Ben picked it up about 3 miles east of the Cole property. Darius and 3 men, heading for the Cheyenne Road at a hard pace. They've got maybe a 4-hour lead, and they're riding fresh horses from the ranch that didn't get scattered in the fire." "What about the records?" "He's got them. We found the broken lock at the land office. The deed books are gone, along with the filing ledgers for the past 5 years. Without those, every property claim in Harlan County is open to challenge, not just the Cole Ranch." Caleb absorbed that. It was worse than he had thought. Darius was not just trying to steal the ranch. He was trying to create chaos deep enough to cover his tracks forever. "How many men are riding with us?" Keller gestured at the group. "Ben, Pete, and 2 ranchers who've had run-ins with Darius before. That's 5, including you and me. Not enough for a full posse, but enough to track, and if we have to take him. It will have to be enough." Caleb checked his cinch and his ammunition. The Colt was clean and fully loaded. He had a box of spare cartridges in his saddlebag, and a 2-day supply of hard biscuit and dried beef that he had taken from his kitchen before riding out. It was not much, but it was what he had. "Let's ride," he said. They rode out of town as the last light faded from the sky. The moon was not yet up, and the stars provided only enough light to follow the road by its pale ribbon of reflection. Caleb rode at the front, beside Keller, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead, looking for signs of passage in the darkness. Ben Tilley had been right about the trail. It was not hard to follow. Darius and his men had not bothered to hide their tracks, either because they were moving too fast or because they did not believe anyone would come after them this quickly. The hoofprints were deep and fresh, cutting through the dust of the road and into the grass on either side. "He's not being careful," Pete said from behind them. "That means he's confident." "Or desperate," Caleb said. "Desperate and confident are the same thing when it comes to men like Darius." They rode through the night in silence, pausing only to water the horses at a creek crossing around midnight. The moon had risen by then, a thin crescent that cast just enough light to make the shadows deeper. Caleb's arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, but the bleeding had stopped, and the pain was a steady companion that kept him awake and alert. By 3 in the morning, they reached a small way station at the intersection of the Cheyenne Road and the northern stage route. It was a single building with a stable attached, run by a man named Croft, who knew Keller from years of passing through. Keller roused him from his bed, and the old man squinted at them through the lantern light with the practiced suspicion of someone who had learned not to ask too many questions. "They came through about 6 hours ago," Croft said. "4 men, leading 3 extra horses. They switched mounts here and pushed on. Paid me double for the fresh horses and told me to forget I saw them." "Did they say anything about where they were heading beyond Cheyenne?" Keller asked. Croft shook his head. "Didn't say much of anything. The leader, tall, gray hair, cold eyes, he just handed me the money and told me to have the horses ready before sunup. The other 3 didn't speak at all." "How much of a lead does that give them now?" Croft calculated. 6 hours on fresh horses. You're on tired ones. By the time you're mounted again, they'll have 8. You're not going to catch them before the territorial line." Keller looked at Caleb. The same calculation was running through both their minds. 8 hours was a lot of ground on fresh horses. The only way to close that gap was to push their own mounts harder than was wise, and even then, it might not be enough. "We push on," Caleb said. "We push on," Keller agreed. They watered the horses, ate a brief meal of cold biscuits, and were back on the road within 20 minutes. The horses had recovered some strength, but not enough. Bess was breathing hard within an hour, and Caleb knew he would have to slow her pace soon or risk losing her altogether. The sky began to lighten in the east, gray at first, then a pale blue that spread across the horizon like water soaking into cloth. The land opened up around them, rolling prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The road ahead was empty. "He could be anywhere out there," Ben said. "He's staying on the road," Keller said. "He's in a hurry, and a man in a hurry takes the shortest path. The road curves north of here, through the Badlands. If we cut across the bend, we might gain an hour." "The Badlands are rough going at night," Pete said. "It's not night anymore." They left the road and struck out across the open prairie, heading northeast toward a distant line of bluffs that marked the edge of the Badlands. The ground was uneven, cut by gullies and dotted with sage, and the horses had to pick their way carefully. But the distance was shorter, and by mid-morning they had reached the bluffs and found the road again on the other side. And there, ahead of them, no more than 2 miles distant, they saw the dust. 4 riders, moving fast, their shapes small against the vastness of the prairie. Caleb's heart kicked in his chest. They had closed the gap. "They've seen us," Keller said. "They're pushing harder." The 4 riders had changed direction, veering off the road and heading toward a line of low hills to the north. They were running, and they were running hard. "After them!" Keller shouted. They rode at a gallop, the horses giving everything they had left. The ground blurred beneath them, the wind tore at Caleb's face, and the sound of hoofbeats filled the world. He leaned low over Bess's neck and urged her onward, feeling her muscles bunch and stretch beneath him, feeling her heart pounding against his knees. The gap closed. A mile, half a mile, a quarter. Caleb recognized the lead rider now. Darius Cole, his coat torn, his hat gone, his hair wild in the wind. He was bent low over his horse, pushing it with a desperation that bordered on madness. Behind him, the 3 men were falling back, their horses tiring faster than his. One of them dropped away, pulling his horse to a stop and raising his rifle. Caleb saw the muzzle flash before he heard the crack of the shot, and the bullet sang past his ear like an angry insect. He did not slow down. He did not even flinch. The man fired again, and this time the bullet struck Bess somewhere in the chest. The mare stumbled, screamed, and went down, throwing Caleb over her head and into the dirt. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs, and rolled with the impact, coming up on his knees with the Colt already in his hand. Bess was behind him, thrashing in the grass, and the sound she made was the sound of a horse who knew she was dying. Caleb did not look at her. He could not afford to look at her. He fired at the shooter, twice, 3 times. The man dropped his rifle and clutched his shoulder, falling from his saddle in a tangle of arms and legs. Caleb did not watch him hit the ground. He was already running. Keller had pulled up and was dismounting, his rifle coming up to his shoulder. He fired once, and one of the remaining riders pitched forward and slid off his horse. The 3rd rider, the last of Darius's men, turned and fled, heading north at a dead run. Darius kept going. He was a quarter mile ahead now, his horse still strong, still running. He had not looked back. Caleb reached Keller and took the reins of the sheriff's spare horse. a sturdy bay that had been tied to the back of Keller's saddle. He swung up without a word and kicked the horse into a gallop. "Caleb, wait!" Keller shouted. He did not wait. He could not wait. The gap was growing, and if Darius reached the territorial line, everything they had fought for would be lost. He rode alone, pushing the bay as hard as he dared, closing the distance foot by foot. The terrain was changing, the prairie giving way to rocky ground and sparse juniper. Ahead, he could see the dark line of a canyon, a deep cut in the earth that ran east and west. If Darius reached it, he could disappear into the maze of its walls and be lost for days. The bay was tiring, but so was Darius's horse. Caleb could see it in the way the animal's stride was shortening, in the way its head was dropping. He was gaining. Darius looked back. Their eyes met across the 100 yards that separated them, and in that moment, Caleb saw something he had not expected to see in Darius Cole's face. It was not anger. It was not triumph. It was fear. The canyon was 50 yards ahead. Darius pushed his horse toward it, and the horse stumbled, recovered, and stumbled again. It was done. It had nothing left. Darius kicked his feet free of the stirrups and jumped, hitting the ground and rolling, coming up with a pistol in his hand. He fired without aiming, a wild shot that went wide, and then he turned and ran toward the canyon on foot. Caleb drew the Colt and fired once, the bullet striking the ground at Darius's feet. Darius did not stop. He reached the edge of the canyon and disappeared over the rim. Caleb pulled the bay to a halt and dismounted. He tied the horse to a juniper and walked to the edge of the canyon, the Colt held low and ready. Below him, the canyon dropped away into shadow. It was not deep, maybe 30 feet, but the walls were steep and the bottom was littered with boulders and scrub. He could see Darius moving among the rocks, limping, his pistol still in his hand. Caleb found a path down, a narrow game trail that wound between the rocks, and he followed it. The walls of the canyon rose around him, cutting off the light, and the air was cool and still. He could hear his own breathing and the scrape of his boots on the stone, and somewhere ahead, the ragged breath of a man who was running out of time. He rounded a bend and found Darius standing in a small clearing, his back to a rock wall, his pistol raised. "That's far enough, Dawson." Caleb stopped. He was 20 feet away, close enough to see the sweat on Darius's face, the exhaustion in his eyes, the desperation that had replaced his composure. "It's over, Darius. The posse is right behind me. You've got nowhere left to run." "I've got plenty of places left to run." Darius's voice was ragged, but it still held that core of defiance. "I've got money in banks from here to San Francisco. I've got contacts who will hide me until this blows over. You think a little fire and a few dead horses are going to stop me? I think you're standing in a canyon with a spent pistol and no horse and a sheriff who's going to be here in about 5 minutes." Darius smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "You're right about one thing. I don't have a horse, but I have something you want." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather satchel, stained with dust and sweat. He held it up, and Caleb could see the shape of books inside it. "The notary records," Caleb said. "Every deed, every filing, every signature for the last 5 years. Without these there is no will, there is no guardianship, there is no claim to the Cole ranch or the Mustang herd or anything else that girl thinks she owns." Caleb kept the Colt steady. "Give me the satchel." "Or what? You'll shoot me?" "Go ahead. I've been shot before. It's not as dramatic as the stories make it sound." Darius's hand moved, and he opened the satchel and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. "But if you shoot me, I fall, and these papers scatter, and the wind takes them. You'll be gathering them for a week, and by then I'll be long gone." "Then don't make me shoot you." Darius laughed. It was a hollow, broken sound. "You know, Dawson, I spent 20 years building everything I had. I bought judges. I bribed clerks. I broke men who got in my way. And I never once thought it would end like this, in a canyon in the middle of nowhere, facing a carpenter with a dead wife and a borrowed gun." He held the papers over the edge of the drop behind him. A single movement, and they would be gone. "Here's what we're going to do," Darius said. "You're going to put the gun down, and I'm going to walk out of this canyon. And in return, I'll leave the records here for you to find. You'll have your evidence, and I'll have my freedom. We both get what we want. Except you get to go free." Free is a relative term. I'll be a hunted man for the rest of my life, but at least I'll be alive. Caleb looked at the papers in Darius's hand. He looked at the satchel. He looked at the man who had killed Samuel Cole, who had whipped his niece, who had burned his own house to cover his crimes. And he thought about Emmy, asleep against Rain's flank in a box canyon 100 miles away, trusting him to come back. "No," he said. He raised the Colt and aimed it at Darius's chest. "You're not walking out of here, not with the records, not without them. You're going to put that satchel down, put your hands up, and wait for the sheriff." Darius's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing. I loaded this gun myself. I checked the cylinder before I rode out. I have 6 rounds left, and I am an excellent shot. The only person who is bluffing here is you." The silence stretched. The wind moved through the canyon, carrying the distant sound of voices. Keller and the others were coming. Darius looked at the papers in his hand. Then he looked at the drop behind him. "You know," he said quietly, "I always wondered what it would feel like to lose." He let the papers fall. They scattered like leaves, caught by the wind, spiraling down into the shadow of the canyon, dozens of pages, each one carrying a piece of the evidence they needed. Caleb's heart stopped. He watched them go, watched them disappear into the crevices and the rocks, watched them settle into places where they might never be found. And in that moment of distraction, Darius lunged. He hit Caleb low, driving his shoulder into Caleb's chest, and they went down together in a tangle of arms and legs. The Colt flew from Caleb's hand and skittered across the rocks. Darius was on top of him, his hands closing around Caleb's throat, his face twisted into a mask of pure animal fury. "I'll kill you," Darius hissed. "I'll kill you, and I'll find that girl, and I'll finish what I started." Caleb brought his knee up, catching Darius in the stomach. The grip on his throat loosened, and he twisted, throwing Darius off. They rolled apart, scrambling for purchase on the loose rock. Darius grabbed a fist-sized stone and swung it. Caleb threw himself sideways, and the stone glanced off his shoulder instead of his skull. Pain exploded down his arm, and he felt something give in the joint, but his hand closed on the Colt. He did not aim. He did not have time to aim. He fired from the ground, a single shot that caught Darius in the leg, just above the knee. Darius screamed and fell, the stone dropping from his hand, his leg collapsing beneath him. Caleb got to his feet. His arm was screaming, his shoulder was on fire, but he was standing, and Darius was not. He walked over to where Darius lay, writhing in the dirt, and he kicked the pistol away from his reaching hand. Then he stood over him, the Colt still pointed at his chest. "You're done." Darius looked up at him, his face pale with pain and shock. For the first time, there was nothing behind his eyes but empty, broken defeat. "You should have killed me," he rasped. "I'm not you," Caleb said. Keller's voice echoed from the rim of the canyon. "Caleb! Are you all right?" "I've got him," Caleb called back. "He's down, but the records, they're scattered. He threw them into the canyon." There was a long pause. Then Keller said, "We'll find them, one by one if we have to." Caleb looked at the papers strewn across the rocks below him, some already stirring in the rising wind. It would take days to gather them all, if they could be gathered at all. Some might never be recovered. But Darius Cole was in the dirt, bleeding and beaten, and that was something. He holstered the Colt and sat down on a boulder, his body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. The voices of the posse grew closer, and the shadows in the canyon began to lengthen as the sun climbed toward noon. Somewhere behind him, in a box canyon 100 miles west, a 10-year-old girl was waiting with a herd of wild horses and a heart full of hope. And he still had to find a way back to her. The canyon was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the rocks and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Caleb sat on the boulder with his head bowed, his arm throbbing, his chest heaving with the aftermath of the fight. Darius lay in the dirt 20 feet away, his leg wrapped in a torn strip of his own shirt that Caleb had tied around the wound to slow the bleeding. The man's face was gray with pain and shock, but he was alive. He would stay alive. That was the kind of justice that mattered, not the swift kind, but the kind that took its time and let the weight of what a man had done settle on him like stones. Keller climbed down into the canyon with Pete and Ben right behind him. They spread out across the rocks, stooping to pick up the scattered papers, carefully smoothing them and stacking them in the leather satchel that one of them had retrieved from where it had fallen. The work was slow and painstaking. Some of the pages had caught on sagebrush. Others had wedged themselves into crevices, where the wind might have carried them away entirely if the canyon walls had not broken its force. But piece by piece, the records were gathered. By the time the sun had climbed past its zenith, the satchel was full again, and the evidence that Darius Cole had tried to destroy was safe. "That's all of them," Pete said, holding up the last page. "I counted twice." "They're all here." Keller took the satchel and slung it over his shoulder. "Then let's get this man to town and get him in front of a judge." They pulled Darius up the canyon wall with ropes, his leg making him cry out twice, but he did not speak. He had stopped speaking after the fight. His eyes were open and aware, but something behind them had closed off, a door that had swung shut and would not open again. He was a man who had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable, and the moment he had been touched, the whole structure of his self had crumbled. The ride back to Harlan County took the rest of the day and half the night. They stopped twice to rest the horses, and at each stop, Keller checked Darius's wound and changed the bandage. The sheriff did not speak to the prisoner beyond what was necessary. There was no cruelty in his silence, but there was no kindness either. It was the silence of a man who had seen too much of what humans could do to each other and had run out of words for it. They reached town in the small hours of the morning. The streets were empty and dark, but a lamp was burning in the window of the sheriff's office, and Nettie Hargrove was sitting on the bench outside with a shotgun across her knees. She stood when she saw them coming, and her eyes went straight to Darius slumping in his saddle, and she nodded once, a sharp, satisfied movement. "Good," she said. "Took you long enough." "Nettie, what are you doing here at this hour?" Keller asked as he dismounted. "Someone had to watch the office while you were gone, and someone had to be here when you brought him back." She looked at Caleb. "The girl is at my place. She wouldn't stay in the canyon after dark. Too many coyotes," she said. "But she made me promise to tell you that the herd is fine, and that she fed them before she left." Caleb felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since he had ridden out of the canyon. "Thank you, Nettie. Go see her. She's been asking every hour. I told her you'd be back, but she's 10 years old, and she's lost too many people to take anything on faith." Caleb did not need to be told twice. He handed the reins of the bay to Ben and walked toward Nettie's house, his legs stiff and his shoulder aching, but his heart lighter than it had been in days. The house was dark except for a single lamp in the front window. He knocked softly, and after a moment the door opened. Emmy stood there in Clara's blue blanket, her hair tangled, her eyes red from crying or from lack of sleep. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she stepped forward and hugged him. It was not a child's hug. It was the hug of someone who had been holding themselves together by sheer will and had finally found a place to let the weight down. She pressed her face into his coat and did not move, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs. "I told you I'd come back," he said. "I know." Her voice was muffled against his coat. "I believed you. I just had to see it." They stood like that for a long time, until her shaking subsided and her breathing steadied. Then she pulled back and looked up at him, her eyes dry now, the old steadiness returning. "Did you get him?" "We got him. He's in the jail." "The records are safe. And the mustangs? The herd is fine. They're still in the canyon. When the legal stuff is settled, we'll move them back to the west pasture." She nodded. Then she said, "Can we go home now?" He understood what she meant. Home was not the canyon or the ranch house that had burned, or his small house with the garden. Home was a place they would build together, piece by piece, on the land that belonged to her father and her mother, and the mustangs that had run there for generations. "Yes," he said, "we can go home." The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and hard labor. Judge Ezra Connell arrived on the morning train 4 days later, having finally gotten through the rail delay that had kept him in Laramie. He was a tall, thin man with silver hair and the kind of patient eyes that came from decades of watching people try to lie to him. He reviewed the will, the deed, the medical reports, Pete Aldis's testimony, and the recovered notary records. He interviewed Emmy alone in Keller's office for an hour, and when he came out, his face was unreadable, but he put his hand on her shoulder and said, "You're a brave young lady, Miss Cole. Your father would be proud." The trial was held in the county courthouse, a small stone building that had not seen as many people in one place since the town's founding day celebration. Every seat was filled, and people stood at the back and in the aisles. Word had spread about what Darius Cole had done, and the town had come to see justice done. Darius sat at the defendant's table with his leg in a cast, and a lawyer from Laramie, who had been paid in advance and looked like he regretted taking the case. The prosecution presented its evidence methodically. Keller testified to the discovery of the stolen filing and the deed in Darius's safe. Doc Crane testified to the injuries on Emmy's body. Pete Aldous testified to what he had heard and seen, his voice steady and clear, his eyes never leaving the jury. And Emmy testified. She walked to the witness stand in a dress that Nettie Hargrove had borrowed from a neighbor and hemmed the night before. Her hair was braided, and she held the tin box in her hands because she had refused to leave it behind. She sat in the chair, which was too big for her, and answered the prosecutor's questions in the same clear, steady voice she had used on the road and in the canyon and on Caleb's porch the first night. She described the whip. She described the weeks of fear. She described her father leaving for Cheyenne and the letter he had left with Widow Hargrove. She described walking 4 miles on bleeding feet to a house she had never seen, because her father had told her that Caleb Dawson was a good man. When she finished, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict on every count. Guilty. Guilty of fraud, guilty of assault, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of arson, guilty of obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced Darius Cole to 25 years in the territorial prison, with no possibility of parole. Darius did not speak when the sentence was read. He did not look at Emmy or Caleb or Keller. He looked at the floor, and he was led away in chains, and the door of the courthouse closed behind him. The crowd filed out into the afternoon sunlight, and Emmy stood on the courthouse steps with Caleb beside her, holding the tin box against her chest. People stopped to speak to her, to shake her hand, to tell her that her father had been a good man and that she had done him proud. She accepted each word with a quiet grace that made Caleb's chest ache. When the last well-wisher had drifted away, Emmy turned to him and said, "Now what?" "Now we go to work." They rode out to the Cole Ranch the next morning. The main house was a blackened shell, the roof gone, the walls charred and collapsed. The bunkhouse had survived, and the barn was still standing, though the fire had singed one wall. The outbuildings were intact. The fences needed mending. The tack room where the will had been hidden was still there, its window still not latching properly. Caleb stood in the yard and looked at the ruin, and he calculated the work ahead in months and years. He was not a young man. His shoulder would take time to heal. His hands were not as strong as they had once been. But he had a purpose now, and that was something he had not had in 7 years. Emmy stood beside him, her hand holding his. "We'll rebuild," she said. It was not a question. "We'll rebuild," he agreed. The rebuilding took the rest of the summer and into the fall. The townspeople helped, showing up on weekends with hammers and saws and baskets of food. Keller came when he could, taking off his sheriff's badge and picking up a carpenter's apron. Nettie Hargrove arrived every morning with coffee and biscuits and stayed until the light failed, organizing the chaos with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Pete Aldous quit the livery and signed on as a full-time hand, sleeping in the bunkhouse and rising before dawn to check on the mustangs. They built a new house on the foundation of the old one, using lumber that Ray Tibbs hauled from the mill at a discount because the town had decided that Emmy Cole was their responsibility now. The new house was smaller than the old one, but it was tight and warm, and it had a porch that faced west, toward the sunset and the Mustang Range. The Mustangs themselves were moved back from the box canyon in a slow, careful drive that took 2 days. Emmy led them on a gentle mare that Caleb had bought from the livery with the last of his savings, and Rain walked beside her, and the herd followed. They settled into the west pasture, as if they had never left, and on the 3rd morning, a new foal was born, a bay colt with a white star on its forehead. Emmy named him Samuel, after her father. October came with golden light and the first chill of winter in the air. The new house was finished, The garden had been put to bed for the season, and the mustangs were fat and healthy on the rich grass of the west pasture. Caleb sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun go down, and Emmy came out and sat beside him. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's a dangerous habit." She smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "I want to stay." "You are staying." "No, I mean, I want to stay here. When I grow up, I want to run the ranch and keep the mustangs and raise horses that are half wild and half tame, the way Papa did. I want this to be my life." Caleb looked at her. The evening light caught her face, and for a moment she did not look like a child who had been through too much too young. She looked like a girl who had found her place in the world and was holding on to it with both hands. "That sounds like a good plan," he said. "Will you stay too?" The question hung in the air. He looked out at the western sky, at the herd moving along the fence line, at the house they had built together, at the garden that would need to be planted in the spring. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the deepening blue of the evening sky. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. And then, from somewhere out in the pasture, a horse whinnied, a long, clear sound that carried across the range like a call. Emmy lifted her head. "That's Rain." "I know. She's calling the herd in for the night." "I know." They sat together, listening to the sound of hoofbeats as the mustangs gathered under the darkening sky, and Caleb thought about the road that had brought them here. He thought about a screen door and a falling child and a letter from a dead man. He thought about Clara's garden and the colt in the trunk and the long years of grief that had hollowed him out and left room for something new to grow. He put his arm around Emmy's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they watched the mustangs drift across the range like shadows, wild and free and utterly alive. And in that moment, Caleb Dawson knew that he had finally found what he had been looking for, even when he had stopped looking. Not a purpose, not a mission, a home. The stars wheeled overhead, the wind moved through the grass, and a 10-year-old girl with a tin box and a heart full of hope sat beside the man who had kept his word, and together they watched the last light fade from the Wyoming sky. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.